It began in a place where nothing was meant to stop an army: open desert, endless sky, and distances so vast they seemed to erase the idea of a front line altogether. El Alamein was not a city of factories or monuments. It was a narrow stretch of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression, a bottleneck in the North African desert where maneuver finally ran out. Here, the war that had raced back and forth across sand and stone was forced to slow down. And when it slowed down, everything changed. By the summer of 1942, the Desert War had already taken on a rhythm of advance and retreat. Armies surged forward. Supply lines stretched too far. Momentum collapsed. Then the cycle repeated. British forces had fallen back again and again. German and Italian units under Rommel had pushed eastward with speed and confidence, threatening Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the lifeline of the British Empire itself. Another retreat felt inevitable, but El Alamein was different. There was nowhere left to fall back to. Behind the Allied line lay Alexandria, Cairo, and the fragile arteries of global supply. Ahead lay an Axis army equally exhausted, equally dependent on supply routes stretched across hostile desert and sea. Both sides knew this would not be another temporary pause. This would be the stand. The desert hardened into a fortress. Minefields were laid in staggering depth. Artillery was positioned with care. Defensive belts stretched mile after mile across the sand. What had once been a war of movement became a war of preparation, patience, and calculation. The desert no longer belonged to speed, it belonged to logistics. When the fighting began, it did not explode forward. It ground forward. The first Battle of El Alamein stopped the Axis advance just short of its goal. Rommel attacked again and again, probing for weakness, but the line held. The desert swallowed men and machines alike. Tanks burned in the heat. Water became as precious as ammunition. Every attack cost more than the last. Then came the pause. And in that pause, everything shifted. British forces rebuilt deliberately. Replacements arrived. Supplies accumulated. Training intensified. The Desert War had taught brutal lessons, and now those lessons were applied without illusion. The goal was no longer survival, it was decision. When the Second Battle of El Alamein began, it began with fire. Artillery thundered across the desert night, lighting the horizon in flashes that never seemed to end. Infantry advanced through minefields under relentless bombardment. Engineers cleared paths under fire, marking lanes that tanks would later follow. Progress was slow, deliberate, and costly. This was not a battle of brilliance. It was a battle of endurance. The Axis forces fought hard, but they were bleeding resources they could not replace. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Reinforcements were scarce. Air superiority slipped away. Every mile lost was harder to regain than the last. As the breakthrough finally came, it did not come cleanly. It came with exhaustion, with units pushed beyond their limits, with commanders knowing there could be no turning back. When the Axis line finally broke, the retreat westward began, and this time, it did not stop. El Alamein marked the end of the Axis advance in North Africa. The Desert War, once fluid and uncertain, now moved in one direction only. El Alamein mattered because it changed belief. It showed that the Axis could be stopped and defeated. It showed that preparation could overcome reputation. It showed that momentum, once lost, might never return. The victory did not end the war in North Africa, but it transformed it. From this point forward, Allied forces would advance, not retreat. The desert would no longer belong to one side's daring, but to the side that could endure longer. Tonight, we return to that narrow stretch of sand, to the minefields and artillery flashes, to the place where the Desert War stopped running and finally stood still, to El Alamein, where the tide turned not with speed, but with resolve. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening quietly, if these long, unhurried journeys into history help you slow down, clear your mind, or step away from the noise of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time, carefully, patiently, and without turning history into spectacle. When you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button. You're helping keep this calm, immersive style of storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, comfort, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the Battle of El Alamein. June 30th, 1942, 60 miles from Alexandria, Egypt. British Lieutenant General Claude Auchinleck stands at the edge of the Mediterranean, watching his exhausted army dig into sand and rock. Behind him stretches 40 miles of hastily prepared defensive positions. Behind those positions, nothing. No fallback line, no reserve position, no plan B. The lights of Alexandria shimmer on the horizon, visible even in daylight when the air is clear. Officers joke nervously that they can almost see the pyramids. No one is laughing. For 18 months, the British Army has retreated across North Africa, abandoning Cyrenaica twice, losing Tobruk just 9 days ago with 33,000 men captured in a single humiliating day. Now they've run out of desert. This narrow gap between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression represents the first position in 1,000 miles that cannot be outflanked. It must hold, or the war in Africa ends. Churchill's government falls. The Suez Canal, the oil fields of the Middle East, perhaps the entire Allied position in the Mediterranean collapses like a house of cards. 60 miles west, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel surveys the same landscape from the opposite direction. His Panzerarmee Africa has just completed the most spectacular advance in modern warfare, capturing Tobruk in a single day and racing eastward with such speed that British units are still retreating when his advance reconnaissance vehicles appear on the horizon. The Desert Fox has earned his nickname through improvisation, daring, and an uncanny ability to sense weakness in enemy positions. His soldiers believe he is invincible. His opponents fear he might be right, but Rommel knows something his troops do not. His tanks are running on fumes, literally scraping the bottom of fuel barrels. His supply lines stretch back 1,500 miles to Tripoli, every mile vulnerable to British air attacks from Malta. His intelligence officers report that the British are finally standing to fight at a place called El Alamein, a railway station that most Germans cannot pronounce and fewer can locate on a map. Rommel orders his exhausted divisions forward anyway. He has no choice. If he pauses, if he allows the British time to reinforce and resupply, his window of opportunity closes forever. Better to attack now with 55 operational tanks than wait and face hundreds of fresh British armor. The mathematics of the situation are brutal and simple. Rommel commands 96,000 troops, split roughly evenly between Germans and Italians, with only 55 tanks in working condition after the long pursuit from Gazala. Fuel reserves give him 3 days of operations, maybe 4 if he's lucky. Auchinleck's 8th Army numbers approximately 150,000 men, but morale is shattered. Units are scattered and disorganized, and many formations exist only on paper after weeks of continuous retreat. The British have about 150 tanks, but many are immobilized for mechanical reasons or lack of spare parts. Artillery ammunition is rationed. No one is confident that supply trucks will arrive tomorrow or the day after. The defending force should have overwhelming advantage, holding a narrow front with numerical superiority. But this is the British Army of 1942, an organization that has demonstrated extraordinary talent for turning numerical advantage into catastrophic defeat. Crete, Greece, France, Norway, the long list of failures haunts every staff officer's nightmare. Why should El Alamein be different? In London, Winston Churchill faces a political crisis as severe as any military disaster in the desert. Parliament is restive, the press hostile, the public exhausted by 3 years of war with nothing but defeat to show for it. On June 21st, news arrived that Tobruk had fallen, captured with barely a fight, 33,000 Commonwealth troops marching into prisoner of war camps while vast stores of fuel, ammunition, and supplies fell into Rommel's hands. Churchill was in Washington, meeting with President Roosevelt when the telegram arrived. Roosevelt leaned across the table and simply asked, "What can we do to help?" The American president ordered 300 Sherman tanks and 100 self-propelled guns immediately shipped to Egypt, a gesture of alliance that would prove decisive. But American tanks take months to arrive. Churchill needs victory now, today, before Parliament's patience expires. A vote of no confidence looms on the calendar. Churchill's entire war strategy, the Mediterranean focus, the decision to prioritize Africa over Asia. Everything depends on holding Egypt. If Auchinleck fails, if Rommel breaks through to Alexandria, Churchill's government falls, and Britain might seek a negotiated peace. The stakes could not be higher. The geography of El Alamein makes it unique in desert warfare. From the Mediterranean coast southward, the terrain slopes gradually downward for exactly 64 kilometers, 40 miles, until it reaches the Qattara Depression, a vast salt marsh 400 feet below sea level, utterly impassable to military vehicles. Every previous defensive position in the western desert could be outflanked, turned from the south by mobile forces racing through open desert. Not here. At El Alamein, there is no open flank. An attacker must come straight at the defenses, grinding through minefields and prepared positions without the option of elegant maneuver. This geographical reality transforms desert warfare from fluid mobile battle to something resembling the Western Front of 1914 through 18, positional warfare where firepower and logistics matter more than tactical brilliance. Auchinleck recognizes this immediately. His staff officers begin preparing defensive boxes, fortified positions held by brigade-strength formations, each box mutually supporting its neighbors with artillery fire. If they can hold, if the line stabilizes, time shifts to Britain's favor. The longer Rommel sits stationary, the more his logistics crisis deepens. But holding depends on soldiers who have retreated for 6 weeks, who watched Tobruk fall after being told it was impregnable, who no longer trust their commanders or believe in their equipment. Private soldiers dig slit trenches in the sand and wire together hasty defensive positions, aware that nothing stands between them and disaster except their own exhausted bodies. The Australian 9th Division takes position on the northern coastal sector, seasoned veterans who fought at Tobruk during the previous siege. They are angry, spoiling for a fight, determined not to retreat another mile. South African, New Zealand, and Indian divisions spread along the line, each nursing grievances from the long retreat, each wondering if this time will be different. British armor sits in reserve, tank crews cleaning sand from gun mechanisms, checking ammunition stores, trying not to think about how German 88mm guns can penetrate their armor at 2,000 yards, while British 2-pounder guns must close to 500 yards for any chance of a kill. The technical inferiority is so severe that some British tank commanders have taken to ramming German tanks, preferring certain death in collision to futile gunnery duels. July 1st, 1942, Rommel's lead reconnaissance units probe the British positions, testing for weakness, seeking the inevitable gap that has appeared in every previous British defensive line. They find wire, mines, artillery fire falling with unexpected accuracy, infantry that doesn't break, and run at the first sight of German armor. Rommel's operations officer reports the disturbing news. The British are standing to fight, the position appears stronger than intelligence indicated, and fuel reserves are critically low. Rommel issues orders for a general assault anyway. The Afrika Korps, Germany's elite desert formation, advances against the northern sector, seeking to smash through to the coastal road and isolate British forces. Italian divisions attack in the center and south, pinning British reserves while German armor seeks the decisive breakthrough. For 3 days, the battle rages with an intensity unusual for desert warfare. British artillery, concentrated in unprecedented density, shatters Italian infantry formations. German tanks penetrate several miles into British positions but then stall, unsupported by infantry, vulnerable to counterattack, running low on fuel and ammunition. By July 4th, Rommel's offensive has failed, not collapsed catastrophically, but simply ground to a halt, momentum spent, objectives unachieved. Auchinleck has done something no British commander has managed in 18 months, stopped Rommel cold. The Afrika Korps, that seemingly invincible formation, sits immobilized 60 miles from Alexandria, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat, locked in an attritional struggle that favors the British. Churchill reads the reports from Cairo with cautious optimism. The line is held, Egypt is safe, for now. But Auchinleck's victory is incomplete, frustrating, unsatisfying. British counterattacks fail to break German positions. Coordination between armor and infantry remains abysmal. Tanks advancing without infantry support, infantry attacking without armor protection, the two arms of the service fighting separate battles on the same battlefield. Opportunities for decisive victory slip away in confusion and missed communications. Rommel is wounded but not destroyed, defeated but not routed. The First Battle of El Alamein, as historians will call it, proves the position is defensible. It does not prove the British Army knows how to attack effectively. That lesson remains to be learned, written in blood across the next 4 months. The summer heat settles over the desert like a physical weight. Both armies dig in, stringing more wire, laying more mines, bringing forward supplies for the next round. Australian patrols raid German positions at night. Vicious small unit actions fought with grenades and bayonets in the darkness. German engineers lay massive minefields, 500,000 mines buried in the sand, creating what they call Devil's Gardens, kill zones designed to channel attackers into pre-registered artillery fire. RAF bombers pound Tobruk and Benghazi, hitting the supply convoys before they can reach the front. The Luftwaffe strikes back at Alexandria and the Suez Canal, but German air strength is stretched thin, inadequate to protect Rommel's supply lines and contest British air superiority simultaneously. The battle has entered a new phase, neither side strong enough to attack decisively, both sides preparing for the next round. In London, Churchill makes a decision that will change everything. Auchinleck stopped Rommel, but stopping is not enough. Britain needs victory, decisive, complete, morale-restoring victory. Auchinleck will be replaced. A new commander is coming, a man who believes in overwhelming force, meticulous planning, and refusing to fight until every advantage is secured. His name is Bernard Law Montgomery, and he will transform the Eighth Army into the instrument that finally breaks the Desert Fox. July 10th, 1942, 0200 hours, Tel El Isa Ridge, Northern Sector. Captain Charles Upham of the New Zealand Division crouches in a slit trench, checking his watch in the darkness. In exactly 3 minutes, 250 British artillery pieces will open fire on the Italian Sabratha Division's positions ahead. His company has orders to assault immediately after the barrage lifts, capture the ridge, and destroy the German radio intercept station that intelligence reports has been reading British signals, traffic for months. Upham is already a legend, recipient of the Victoria Cross for actions at Crete, a man whose reputation for aggressive leadership and personal courage borders on reckless. Tonight he will earn a bar to that Victoria Cross, becoming one of only 3 men in history to receive the award twice. But in this moment, none of that matters. What matters is the ridge ahead, the German interceptors reading every British radio message, and the 200 men waiting for his signal to advance into machine gun fire and artillery. The barrage begins with a roar that seems to shake the earth itself. 250 guns firing simultaneously create a sound beyond hearing, a physical pressure that compresses the chest and makes thinking difficult. Upham signals his company forward into the fire and dust. The First Battle of El Alamein, fought from July 1st through 27th, was not a single battle, but a series of attritional struggles, each side launching attacks designed to wear down the enemy, seize key terrain, and identify weaknesses in defensive positions. The July battles revealed patterns that would define the October showdown. Italian infantry divisions collapsed quickly under sustained bombardment. German formations fought with desperate skill even when outnumbered, and British combined arms coordination remained dangerously dysfunctional. Auchinleck's strategy was sound in concept, aggressive counterattacks to prevent Rommel from organizing a methodical assault, but execution suffered from the chronic problems that plagued the Eighth Army throughout 1942. Armor and infantry operated as separate forces, corps commanders failed to coordinate attacks, and opportunities for decisive action dissolved in confusion and mutual recrimination between different branches of service. The July battles stopped Rommel, but could not destroy him, a frustrating halfway house between defeat and victory that satisfied no one. Tel El Isa fell to Upham's assault in the pre-dawn darkness, 736 Italian prisoners taken, the German radio intercept station destroyed, along with its priceless intelligence archive. But British success triggered immediate German response. The 15th Panzer Division counterattacked at dawn with 40 tanks, nearly overwhelming the New Zealand infantry before British artillery broke up the assault. This pattern repeated across the battlefield through July. Commonwealth infantry would capture objectives at night, German armor would counterattack at first light, and the question became whether British artillery could destroy German tanks before they overran exposed infantry positions. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The fundamental problem remained unsolved: how to coordinate armor, infantry, and artillery so they fought as one force, rather than three separate arms pursuing unrelated objectives. German doctrine integrated these elements at division level, panzer divisions combining tanks, motorized infantry, and self-propelled artillery under unified command. British doctrine kept them separate: armor in armored divisions, infantry in infantry divisions, meeting on the battlefield as strangers with different radio frequencies and incompatible tactical vocabularies. July 14th and 15th brought Operation Bacon, Auchinleck's attempt to seize Ruwaysit Ridge, the commanding terrain in the central sector. The 2nd New Zealand Division attacked at night, achieving complete surprise, overwhelming Italian defenders, and capturing the ridge by dawn. Success seemed complete. Then British armor failed to arrive as promised. The 23rd Armored Brigade, tasked with supporting the New Zealand infantry, lost its way in darkness, arrived hours late, and advanced without coordinating with the infantry they were supposed to protect. German 88mm anti-tank guns dug into prepared positions, opened fire at 2,000 yards. British Valentine tanks, with armor too thin to resist 88mm shells and guns too weak to penetrate German armor at that range, died in rows. 40 tanks destroyed in minutes. The survivors retreated, leaving New Zealand infantry isolated on Ruwaysit Ridge, exposed to inevitable German counterattack. By evening, the New Zealanders had withdrawn, the ridge was back in Axis hands, and another opportunity for breakthrough had dissolved in the familiar pattern of uncoordinated failure. The 23rd Armored Brigade's destruction on July 21st encapsulated everything wrong with British tactical doctrine in mid-1942. 87 Valentine tanks advanced across open ground in broad daylight without infantry support, artillery support, or air support, directly toward prepared German anti-tank positions. It was suicide disguised as offensive operations. Brigade commander watched helplessly as German guns methodically destroyed his tanks, unable to return effective fire, unable to retreat through the minefields behind them, dying in a perfect example of how not to employ armor in modern warfare. 40 tanks destroyed, another 30 damaged, so severely they required workshop-level repairs. The survivors limped back to British lines, having achieved nothing except demonstrating that courage cannot overcome tactical incompetence. Post-battle analysis revealed the systemic problem. Armored commanders believed tanks should fight other tanks in mobile engagements, considering infantry support a waste of their capabilities. Infantry commanders expected armor to arrive on schedule and protect their flanks. Neither understood the other's capabilities, limitations, or doctrine. They fought separate wars on the same battlefield. Rommel, watching from the German side, recognized his opportunity was slipping away. Every day brought British reinforcements, fresh tanks from Egyptian workshops, ammunition convoys from the Delta. His own supply situation deteriorated steadily. Italian convoys attempting the Mediterranean crossing faced RAF attacks from Malta and Royal Navy submarines vectored by ultra-intelligence decrypts. Ships that survived the crossing often arrived at Tobruk or Benghazi, only to be bombed in harbor by long-range RAF bombers. Fuel consumption exceeded delivery by factors of 3 or 4. Rommel's quartermaster calculated that the Panzer Army needed 50,000 tons of supplies monthly to sustain offensive operations. July delivery totaled 8,000 tons. The mathematics were impossible, the strategic situation hopeless. But Rommel refused to accept the obvious conclusion. He believed, with some justification, that one more push, one more brilliant maneuver, could shatter British morale and restart the advance. The British Army had broken so many times before. Why not once more? July 27th marked the end of the First Battle of El Alamein, neither side able to continue offensive operations. Both armies exhausted, ammunition depleted, formations shattered. Casualty statistics told the story of attritional stalemate. Commonwealth forces suffered 13,250 casualties, including 4,000 captured. Axis forces 10,000 casualties, including 7,000 Italian prisoners. Tank loss ratios seemed to favor the Germans. 196 British tanks destroyed versus 60 Axis. But the numbers concealed the strategic reality. Britain could replace lost tanks within weeks. Germany could not. More significantly, the Italian infantry divisions that provided the bulk of Axis manpower were combat ineffective, shattered by British artillery fire, demoralized by German commanders, who blamed them for every failure while assigning them the worst positions and oldest equipment. The Trento, Brescia, and Bologna divisions existed as organizational shells, divisions in name only, incapable of sustained combat operations. Rommel's army was rotting from the inside, Italian morale collapsing, German units exhausted, logistics in crisis. But Auchinleck's victory rang hollow in London and Cairo. Yes, he had stopped Rommel. Yes, the line held when everyone expected collapse. But British attacks achieved nothing decisive. Opportunities for breakthrough appeared and vanished in coordination failures. Most frustrating of all, Rommel remained in place, his army wounded but intact, capable of defending and potentially capable of attacking again if supplies arrived. Churchill wanted Rommel destroyed, the Axis army annihilated, German survivors streaming westward en route. Instead, he got stalemate, attritional bloodletting that stopped German advance without creating conditions for British breakthrough. The Prime Minister's patience, never abundant, expired completely. Auchinleck would be replaced. The problem was identifying someone who could do better. Previous commanders had failed spectacularly. Cunningham suffered a nervous breakdown during Operation Crusader, Ritchie lost the Gazala battles, and Tobruk through sheer incompetence. Auchinleck stopped Rommel, but couldn't destroy him. Who in the British army possessed the skill, confidence, and ruthlessness to finally win decisively in the desert? The Australian 9th Division emerged from the July battles with enhanced reputation, confirming their status as the 8th Army's most reliable infantry. Their attacks on Tel El Isa, Thompson's Post, and along the coastal sector demonstrated what was possible when infantry attacked with proper artillery support, clear objectives, and commanders who understood combined arms warfare. Australian infantry worked closely with British artillery, developing the coordination that other formations lacked. They also proved willing to take casualties to achieve objectives, a harsh calculation but militarily necessary in attritional warfare. The Australians would play a crucial role in October's decisive battle, holding the northern coastal sector where Montgomery would concentrate his main effort. But in July, their success only highlighted the dysfunction elsewhere in 8th Army. If one division could fight effectively, why couldn't the others? The answer lay not in the courage or competence of individual soldiers, but in doctrine, training, and leadership. Those elements would be transformed over the next 3 months under new command. The July battles established the strategic framework for everything that followed. The El Alamein position was defensible, geography favored the defender, and Rommel could not break through by improvisation and daring alone. But the battles also revealed that defensive success did not automatically translate to offensive capability. Auchinleck proved the British Army could defend. Montgomery would have to prove it could attack, break through prepared positions, coordinate combined arms operations, and maintain momentum during exploitation phase. The technical and tactical problems identified in July, coordination failures, inadequate armor-infantry cooperation, poor artillery-infantry integration, all required systematic solutions. Incremental improvement would not suffice. The 8th Army needed complete restructuring, new commanders, new doctrine, new training methods, and new equipment. Most of all, it needed psychological transformation, soldiers who believed victory was possible, commanders who planned for success rather than preparing retreat plans. That transformation began in August 1942, when a new army commander arrived in the desert, canceled all withdrawal contingencies, and announced that there would be no retreat from El Alamein under any circumstances. His name was Montgomery, and everything was about to change. August 15th, 1942, Mediterranean Sea, 200 miles north of Tobruk. The Italian tanker Pichi Fascio plows through moderate seas, engines laboring, hull riding low in the water from 2,600 tons of aviation gasoline in her tanks. Her captain scans the horizon nervously, knowing that British submarines hunt these waters, that RAF bombers from Malta patrol the convoy routes, that every mile closer to Libya brings increased danger. His cargo represents 1 month of Luftwaffe operations in North Africa, enough fuel to keep German fighters and bombers flying, protecting Rommel's supply convoys, contesting British air superiority. Without this fuel, the Luftwaffe withdraws from forward airfields. Without air cover, subsequent convoys die. The Pichi Fascio is not just a tanker. She is a linchpin in the entire Axis logistics system, her survival or destruction determining whether Rommel can continue operations in Egypt. At 1400 hours, the British submarine HMS Turbulence Periscope breaks the surface 3,000 yards distant. Lieutenant Commander John Linton studies the target, confirms identity, orders firing solution calculated. 4 torpedoes launch in rapid succession. 2 strike home. The Pichi Fascio's aviation gasoline explodes in a fireball visible for 30 miles. 2,600 tons of irreplaceable fuel burning. Enough to move the Africa Corps 100 kilometers, gone in minutes. The Battle of El Alamein was decided as much in the Mediterranean Sea as on Egyptian sand. Rommel's operational genius, tactical brilliance, and legendary improvisation meant nothing when his army lacked fuel to maneuver, ammunition to fire, and food to eat. The strategic equation was simple, brutal, and mathematically inescapable. Rommel's Panzer Army required approximately 50,000 tons of supplies monthly to sustain offensive operations. From July through October 1942, monthly deliveries averaged 8,000 tons. No amount of tactical skill could overcome this deficit. The Desert Fox had driven to within 60 miles of Alexandria on courage, daring, and captured British fuel dumps. He could not advance further without supply convoys reaching North Africa intact, and those convoys faced a gauntlet of British air and naval forces that grew more lethal every week. Malta, that tiny island fortress Britain refused to surrender, sat astride the convoy routes like a stone in a river, forcing Italian ships into predictable channels where submarines waited and bombers hunted. The logistics war in the Mediterranean determined the ground war in Egypt more decisively than any tactical maneuver. Ultra-intelligence, Britain's closely guarded secret of having broken German military codes, transformed Mediterranean logistics warfare from difficult to catastrophic for the Axis. British code breakers at Bletchley Park read German signals traffic detailing convoy schedules, routes, cargoes, and escort composition. This intelligence flowed to Royal Navy, submarine commanders, and RAF bomber crews within hours, sometimes minutes. Submarines positioned themselves along convoy routes with devastating precision. On September 2nd, a convoy bound for Tobruk, carrying an entire month's ammunition supply for the Africa Corps, was intercepted using ultra-intelligence. Ships carrying 5,000 tons of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition went to the bottom, forcing Rommel to postpone his planned offensive for weeks while emergency supplies were scraped together. The German and Italian high commands never understood why their convoys suffered such precise, devastating losses. They blamed Italian naval incompetence, inadequate air cover, and bad luck. They never suspected that British intelligence read their mail, knew convoy schedules before Italian ship captains received orders, and positioned forces accordingly. Malta's resurgence from near starvation in April through June to offensive powerhouse by September transformed the Mediterranean logistics equation. During Malta's crisis, when the island's RAF units were reduced to a handful of fighters and bombers, Axis convoy losses ran around 30%, sustainable if barely so. As Malta recovered, reinforced by Spitfires flown from aircraft carriers, resupplied by convoys that fought through at tremendous cost, convoy losses climbed towards 75% in August, before stabilizing around 50% through October. The mathematics were impossible. Italy's merchant fleet could not sustain 50% losses. Ships sunk could not be replaced. Italian shipyards lacked capacity to build replacements faster than losses. Experienced ship captains and crews drowned, irreplaceable expertise lost. Surviving captains grew increasingly reluctant to sail, knowing each voyage carried better than even odds of death. The Italian Navy's surface fleet, theoretically powerful, remained largely in port, fuel oil, rationing, and fear of British naval aviation limiting operations. Italian admirals watched helplessly as their merchant fleet bled to death, crossing a sea they theoretically controlled. Rommel's fuel crisis drove every operational decision from July through October. The Panzer Army needed 30,000 tons of fuel monthly for offensive operations, 10,000 tons for defensive operations, 5,000 tons for bare survival. July delivery, 7,000 tons. August, 6,000 tons. September, 5,000 tons. October, 4,000 tons. Each month, the deficit deepened, operational freedom contracted, strategic options narrowed. German quartermasters calculated that Rommel's planned August offensive toward Alam Halfa required 6,000 tons of fuel. He had 3,000 when operations commenced, gambling that attacking Allied positions would yield captured fuel dumps, as had occurred so often before. When the British refused to collapse, when their defensive positions held and no fuel dumps fell into German hands, Rommel's offensive died not from tactical defeat but simple fuel exhaustion. His tanks literally ran dry, immobilized in the desert, easy targets for RAF fighter bombers. Retreat consumed the last fuel reserves. The Battle of Alam Halfa proved that the era of Rommel's improvised miracles had ended. Without logistics, tactical genius achieved nothing. The Luftwaffe's improvised aerial supply operation revealed desperation's true face. When surface convoys could not deliver sufficient fuel, German transport aircraft attempted to bridge the gap. Heinkel, He-111 bombers, converted to cargo haulers, parachuting fuel barrels and ammunition containers directly to forward positions. The operation was dangerous, expensive, and delivered pathetically small tonnage compared to needs. Each transport aircraft carried perhaps 2 tons of fuel, requiring 15 sorties daily just to deliver 30 tons, barely enough to keep one Panzer division operational. British fighters hunted the transports mercilessly. Luftwaffe losses mounted to unsustainable levels, experienced aircrew dying to deliver fuel in quantities too small to matter operationally. By October, the air supply effort had effectively ceased. One more failed improvisation in Rommel's lengthening list of desperate expedients. The Desert Fox was learning what Napoleon knew. Logistics constrained strategy more ruthlessly than any enemy army. The comparison between British and Axis supply situations revealed the fundamental asymmetry that determined North Africa's outcome. British supply lines ran overland from Cape Town, South Africa, around the continent's southern tip, through the Suez Canal to Cairo and Alexandria, approximately 2,500 kilometers, but relatively secure from interdiction. The Royal Navy controlled the Cape route, U-boats were absent from the Indian Ocean, and supplies accumulated in Egyptian depots faster than the Eighth Army could consume them. By October, British supply dumps contained sufficient ammunition for 6 months of intensive combat operations, enough fuel for 3 months, enough food for a year. The disparity was so extreme that Montgomery literally could not spend supplies fast enough. His artillery fire plans called for 1 million shells in the first 5 days of offensive operations, more ammunition than Rommel's entire supply for 6 months. This was not warfare. It was industrial demolition, overwhelming material superiority applied systematically to destroy enemy forces through sheer weight of fire. Ultra-intelligence's contribution to logistics warfare extended beyond convoy interdiction to operational deception. British intelligence not only read German signals, but used that knowledge to plant false information, feeding the German intelligence system reports of British weakness, equipment shortages, and delayed reinforcements. Rommel's staff estimated British tank strength in early October at 700 vehicles. Actual strength exceeded 1,000. German intelligence believed Montgomery needed until mid-November to prepare offensive operations. He attacked October 23rd. This intelligence advantage, combined with ruthless exploitation through air and naval forces, created conditions where Axis defeat became mathematically certain. Rommel could not win at El Alamein because he lacked resources to sustain offensive operations. He could not defend successfully because he lacked fuel to maneuver, ammunition to fire, and reserves to replace casualties. The logistics war was lost before the ground battle began, but Rommel's orders required him to fight anyway, expending his army in futile resistance against an enemy whose material superiority grew more overwhelming daily. Italian Supreme Command meetings in Rome through late summer grew increasingly surreal, senior officers discussing Mediterranean logistics as if rational planning could overcome inescapable mathematics. General Ugo Cavallero, Italian Chief of Staff, explained repeatedly why ships could not sail, why convoys suffered catastrophic losses, why promises of delivery could not be kept. He faced German officers who demanded immediate action, who blamed Italian incompetence rather than recognizing structural impossibility of the strategic situation. The relationship between Axis partners deteriorated toward mutual contempt. German commanders blamed Italians for every failure, while Italian officers resented fighting Germany's war with inadequate resources and outdated equipment. At Panzer Army headquarters, Rommel's operations staff calculated supply requirements with precision: 30,000 tons monthly for offense, 15,000 for defense, 8,000 for survival. They received the 8,000 if lucky, sometimes less. Headquarters staff began planning withdrawal contingencies, calculating how far the army could retreat on existing fuel stocks, identifying defensive positions further west. Nobody discussed these plans with Hitler, who refused to contemplate retreat under any circumstances. By October 1942, Rommel commanded an army that existed largely on paper. His German divisions retained combat effectiveness but operated at perhaps 60% of authorized strength. Italian divisions were combat ineffective shells, formations that would collapse at first sustained pressure. His tank strength numbered 489 vehicles, but less than half possessed fuel for more than a day's operations. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day, barely sufficient for defensive fire, utterly inadequate for offensive support. Food supplies ran low enough that soldiers' rations were cut, hungry troops fighting on inadequate calories. Medical supplies were critically short. Wounded soldiers received minimal care. Disease spread through unsanitary conditions. The Panzer Army Africa was dying from logistical strangulation, a process as inexorable as it was invisible to soldiers in the front-line trenches. When Montgomery attacked on October 23rd with overwhelming material superiority, the outcome was determined not by that night's tactical fighting, but by 6 months of convoy battles, submarine attacks, and ultra-guided interdiction that bled Rommel's logistics system white. The Battle of El Alamein was won in the Mediterranean long before the first shell fell on Egyptian sand. August 13, 1942, afternoon, Cairo, Egypt. Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery steps from his aircraft at Cairo's military airfield, desert heat hitting him like a physical force after the relative cool of London. He is 54 years old, thin, sharp-featured, with eyes that miss nothing and a manner that oscillates between fierce confidence and insufferable arrogance. He has been selected, almost by accident, to command the 8th Army in place of the dismissed Auchinleck, chosen only because Lieutenant General William Gott, Churchill's first choice, was killed yesterday when his transport aircraft was shot down by German fighters. Gott's death changed history. Montgomery is a difficult subordinate, notorious for refusing orders he disagrees with, contemptuous of superiors he considers incompetent, and convinced of his own military genius in ways that make other officers uncomfortable. He is also a brilliant trainer, an innovative tactician, and a commander who inspires absolute loyalty in troops who serve under him. Within 24 hours of arriving in Egypt, he will transform the 8th Army's psychology, canceling all contingency withdrawal plans, announcing that there will be no retreat from El Alamein under any circumstances, and beginning the systematic overhaul of doctrine, training, and command relationships that will turn a defeated army into an offensive juggernaut. The command crisis that brought Montgomery to Egypt had been building for months, rooted in structural problems as much as individual failures. Previous British commanders in North Africa operated under impossible conditions, simultaneously commanding theater-level strategic operations as Commander-in-Chief Middle East, while directly commanding the 8th Army's tactical operations. The span of control was too wide, responsibilities too diverse, demands too contradictory. Auchinleck tried to manage Palestine's security, Iraq's oil fields, Persia's defense, and the Western Desert's tactical battles simultaneously. He succeeded at none completely. Churchill's solution was elegant: split the commands. General Harold Alexander became Commander-in-Chief Middle East, responsible for theater strategy, logistics, and political relationships. Montgomery took tactical command of 8th Army, responsible solely for destroying Rommel. The division of responsibility allowed each commander to focus on their appropriate level of warfare, ending the confusion that plagued previous operations. It also gave Montgomery something previous commanders lacked: a superior officer who trusted him, protected him from political interference, and allowed him to train and prepare without Churchill's constant pressure for immediate offensive action. Montgomery's first meeting with 8th Army headquarters staff has become legendary. His opening statement delivered with characteristic bluntness that shocked officers accustomed to Auchinleck's genteel manner. "I don't like the atmosphere I find here," Montgomery announced. "It's an atmosphere of doubt, of looking back. All that must cease. We will stand and fight here. If we can't stay here alive, then let us stay here dead." The effect was electric. Staff officers who had been preparing withdrawal plans, contingency positions for retreating to the Nile Delta, emergency evacuation procedures for Cairo, suddenly faced a commander who denied retreat was possible. Montgomery ordered all withdrawal plans burned. Every officer who mentioned retreat was to be relieved. The 8th Army would defend El Alamein or die there. No other options existed. This was partly psychological theater, Montgomery understanding that defeated armies think about retreat, victorious armies think about attack. But it was also operational reality. The El Alamein position could not be outflanked. If the British Army could not defend this position, it could not defend anywhere in North Africa. Better to make the stand here, now, under conditions that favored defense, than retreat to worse positions closer to vital objectives. Montgomery's personnel changes extended beyond staff officers to corps command, bringing in subordinates he trusted, commanders who shared his vision of methodical, overwhelming offensive operations. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks took command of 13th Corps, the southern sector facing the Qattara Depression. Horrocks was a dynamic, aggressive commander who had served under Montgomery in Britain, understanding his methods and expectations. Lieutenant General Oliver Leese took XXX Corps in the northern sector, another Montgomery protege selected for reliability and tactical skill. The new artillery commander, Brigadier Sidney Kirkman, revolutionized artillery employment, creating corps-level fire control that could mass hundreds of guns on single targets within minutes. These were not random assignments, but careful selection of commanders who would implement Montgomery's vision of warfare. Infantry breaks through prepared defenses under overwhelming artillery support, armor exploits through gaps infantry creates, and close coordination between all arms prevents the disastrous failures that characterized previous operations. The training revolution began immediately. Montgomery, recognizing that doctrine and courage meant nothing if soldiers didn't know how to execute combined arms operations. Every infantry battalion practiced night attacks with live artillery support, advancing behind creeping barrages timed to the minute. Tank crews trained to work with infantry, learning to suppress enemy positions while infantry cleared anti-tank guns. Engineers practiced mine clearance under fire, developing techniques and equipment that would prove crucial in October. Most revolutionary was Montgomery's insistence that corps commanders coordinate operations personally, meeting face-to-face to synchronize attacks, rather than relying on radio communications that so often failed. The British Army had to learn to fight as integrated force rather than separate arms, pursuing unrelated objectives. This required months of training, more time than Churchill wanted to allow, but Montgomery refused to attack until his army was ready. He had watched previous commanders launch premature offensives that collapsed in coordination failures. He would not repeat those mistakes. Churchill's political calculation drove the command changes as much as military necessity. The Prime Minister needed victory, symbolic, complete, morale-restoring victory that would silence critics and demonstrate Britain remained a serious military power. Auchinleck's defensive success was insufficient, operationally successful but psychologically unsatisfying. "Before Alamein, we never had a victory," Churchill later wrote. "After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The statement was historically inaccurate but politically astute, creating a narrative of El Alamein as the war's turning point, the moment when British fortunes reversed. To make that narrative work, Churchill needed a commander who would deliver crushing victory, not cautious defensive success. Montgomery's personality, his flair for publicity, his instinct for dramatic gesture, made him ideal for this role. He understood that modern warfare included propaganda, public relations, and political dimensions, as well as tactical operations. He would give Churchill his victory, but only when ready, only when conditions guaranteed success. Auchinleck's dismissal was unfair, arguably one of Churchill's more unjust command decisions. Auchinleck had stopped Rommel when previous commanders failed, stabilizing the front when collapse seemed inevitable, fighting the First Battle of El Alamein to successful conclusion despite overwhelming disadvantages. His reward was relief from command, replacement by a man who inherited Auchinleck's prepared positions, Auchinleck's accumulated supplies, and Auchinleck's defensive success. Montgomery fought the Second Battle of El Alamein from positions Auchinleck established, with logistics Auchinleck organized, against an enemy Auchinleck had already defeated once. The injustice gnawed at officers who served under Auchinleck, creating lasting resentment toward Montgomery. But warfare is not fair, politics are not just, and Churchill needed a symbol more than he needed historical accuracy. Auchinleck had saved Egypt. Montgomery would receive credit for winning the decisive battle, a substitution that would rankle historians for decades, but served Britain's political needs in 1942's dark days. The question of William Gott's hypothetical command fascinates military historians. Gott was Churchill's first choice, a desert veteran beloved by troops, experienced in North African conditions, familiar with terrain and enemy tactics. He was also exhausted, suffering from combat fatigue after 2 years of continuous operations, possibly too cautious after witnessing so many British defeats. Montgomery brought fresh perspective, ruthless determination, and willingness to demand impossible efforts from subordinate commanders. Gott might have fought differently, perhaps more conventionally, possibly less successfully. His death guaranteed Montgomery's appointment, and Montgomery's methods, training revolution, and systematic planning guaranteed El Alamein would be fought as methodical set-piece battle rather than improvised maneuver warfare. Gott's burning aircraft changed not just who commanded, but how the battle was fought, shifting British approach from reactive to deliberate, defensive to offensive, defeatist to confident. History turned on a fighter pilot's burst of cannon fire that brought down a transport aircraft and killed a general most soldiers had never heard of. August through October 1942 represented the Eighth Army's transformation from defeated to victorious force. The transformation was not primarily about equipment, though new Sherman tanks and self-propelled artillery helped. It was not primarily about numbers, though reinforcements and recovered casualties increased strength. The transformation was psychological, doctrinal, and organizational. Defeated armies think about how to avoid losing. Victorious armies think about how to win. Montgomery drilled into every officer and soldier that the Eighth Army would attack, would break through German defenses, would destroy Rommel's forces completely. This confidence was not automatic or inevitable. It required constant reinforcement through training, through Montgomery's personal visits to units, where he explained his plan to ordinary soldiers, through successful defensive battle at Alam Halfa in late August that proved the new methods worked. By October, the Eighth Army believed in itself, believed in Montgomery, and believed that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. That belief mattered more than tank counts or artillery pieces. Soldiers who believe they will win fight differently than soldiers who expect defeat, press attacks harder, recover from setbacks faster, and exploit success more ruthlessly. Montgomery's greatest achievement was not tactical or operational, but psychological, transforming the Eighth Army's self-image from losers to winners before the decisive battle began. The August command changes established framework for October's offensive, but required validation through combat. That validation came at Alam Halfa in late August, when Rommel launched his final offensive attempt, seeking to break through British positions before Montgomery's defensive preparations were complete. The Battle of Alam Halfa would test whether Montgomery's confidence was justified or merely another commander's doomed optimism. British soldiers waited in prepared positions. Artillery crews checked firing tables. Tank commanders studied approaches through binoculars, and Montgomery watched from headquarters, supremely confident that his defensive battle plan would work. Either the new methods would succeed, or the Eighth Army would collapse like so many times before. There was no middle ground, no acceptable compromise. At Alam Halfa, everything would be proven or disproven, validated or exposed as delusion. The battle began with Rommel's characteristic aggression. Panzer divisions driving into British positions, seeking the breakthrough that had worked so many times before. This time would be different. This time, the British were ready, waiting, confident in their defenses and their commander. The defensive masterpiece was about to begin. August 30th, 1942, 2200 hours. Southern Sector, El Alamein Line. Lieutenant David Sterling of the Special Air Service sits in a forward observation post, watching German engineers probe British minefields in the darkness. Tomorrow, Rommel will attack, driving through this southern sector with his remaining armor, seeking to outflank British positions and force the decisive mobile battle where German tactical superiority traditionally dominates. Sterling knows this because ultra-intelligence decrypts have revealed Rommel's entire plan, his axis of advance, his objectives, even his timeline. Montgomery has read Rommel's orders before some German commanders received them, a level of intelligence advantage unprecedented in warfare. British dispositions match German plans with unsettling precision, artillery pre-registered on approaches Rommel will use, armor positioned on ridges Rommel must assault, minefields thickened in sectors Rommel plans to penetrate. It is almost unfair, opponent knowing your every move before you make it. But war is not fair, and Rommel has benefited from intelligence advantages often enough. Tonight, the tables turn decisively. The Desert Fox is about to walk into a trap designed specifically for him, defended by an army that finally knows how to fight. Ultra-intelligence transformed Alam Halfa, from ordinary defensive battle to choreographed masterpiece. The decrypt arrived August 30th at 1000 hours. German radio signal outlining Rommel's offensive plan in perfect detail. Southern sector penetration, drive northeast toward Alam Halfa Ridge, force British armor into mobile battle, destroy tanks, and break through to coastal supply dumps. Montgomery read the decrypt, compared it to his existing defensive plan, and smiled. His dispositions already anticipated Rommel's moves. The 22nd Armored Brigade sat on Alam Halfa Ridge, hold-down positions allowing tanks to fire from cover while remaining protected from return fire. The minefield in the southern sector, designated February, had been thickened beyond German intelligence estimates, containing over 50,000 mines rather than the 20,000 Rommel expected. Artillery was pre-registered on every approach. RAF bombers were briefed to attack German armor throughout the night, preventing rest and consuming precious fuel. Montgomery issued orders without modification. His plan was already perfect because it anticipated enemy actions with perfect intelligence. All that remained was execution. August 31st, 0 to 200 hours. German engineers enter the February minefield, attempting to clear paths for following armor. They immediately discover the minefield is far deeper, far denser than intelligence indicated. Mine detectors sweep frantically, engineers marking cleared lanes with white tape that must remain visible in darkness. Behind them, panzer divisions wait in assembly areas, tank commanders checking watches, wondering why the advance is delayed. RAF Wellington bombers appear overhead, dropping 1,000-pound bombs on clustered vehicles. The explosions ripple through assembly areas, destroying trucks, killing soldiers, igniting fuel dumps. Chaos spreads through the German concentration. Commanders attempt to restore order, while engineers continue clearing mines, each sweep agonizingly slow, casualties mounting. 5 hours pass. Dawn approaches. The overnight exploitation that Rommel planned becomes daytime advance under full observation, every tactical advantage evaporating with the darkness. Rommel's operations officer calculates fuel consumption against reserves, delivers the bad news. The delay has consumed fuel planned for the breakthrough phase. The offensive is compromised before it properly begins. September 1st, early afternoon. Rommel's panzer divisions finally clear the minefields, reorganize, and advance northeastward toward Alam Halfa Ridge. The 22nd Armored Brigade waits on the ridge's reverse slope, hull down. Only turrets and guns visible from German perspective. British Grant tanks mount 75mm guns in hull sponsons, able to engage targets at 2,000 yards, outranging German Panzer Mark III and IV tanks' main armament. The tactical geometry favors defense completely. German tanks must advance across open ground, exposed, while British tanks fire from covered positions. German commanders recognize the trap, but have no choice. Withdrawal means accepting defeat without achieving anything. Advance means accepting casualties to reach an objective that may prove unattainable. They order the advance. British gunners wait with trained patience, fingers on triggers, range estimates calculated, deflection angles computed. At 1,500 yards, the order comes. Fire. British shells pour into German formations, turrets exploding, tanks burning, survivors attempting to return fire while buttoned up and moving, accuracy impossible. The attack staggers, halts, resumes, staggers again. German armor cannot close to effective range. The attack collapses. Montgomery's tactical innovation at Alam Halfa was refusing to counterattack. Traditional doctrine demanded that defending forces counterattack immediately after repelling enemy assault, exploiting confusion and disorganization. Montgomery ordered his armor to hold positions, refuse engagement, let Germans batter themselves against prepared defenses. This required extraordinary discipline, tank commanders watching enemy retreat, every instinct demanding pursuit, orders requiring restraint. Churchill sent angry cables from London, demanding aggressive exploitation, asking why Montgomery refused to press his advantage. Montgomery replied calmly. The objective was not to destroy Rommel's tanks, but to prove that the new British methods worked, to build confidence in the Eighth Army that would be essential for October's offensive. Pursuing German armor into open desert risked replicating the coordination failures that plagued previous British operations. Better to win defensively, prove the army could execute planned operations successfully, then prepare for the deliberate offensive that would destroy Rommel completely. Churchill was furious. Montgomery was correct. History vindicated the restraint. September 2nd, Rommel's fuel crisis reached critical mass. His quartermaster calculated remaining fuel stocks, sufficient for 2 days of defensive operations, possibly 3 if consumption was carefully rationed, definitely insufficient for continuing offensive operations and subsequent withdrawal to start lines. The arithmetic was inexorable, the conclusion inescapable. The offensive must cease immediately, withdrawal begin tonight, or the Panzer Army would immobilize itself in the desert without fuel to retreat, trapped by its own logistics failure. Rommel issued orders for withdrawal with characteristic decisiveness, recognizing that continuing the attack meant destroying his army for nothing. September 3rd through 5th, German forces withdrew through the minefields they had cleared, harassed by RAF bombers, shelled by British artillery, retreating to original positions and beyond. British counterattacks were deliberately limited, probing attacks designed to maintain pressure without risking the carefully rebuilt army. Montgomery's caution frustrated aggressive commanders, but proved wise. Alam Halfa demonstrated new methods worked. October would prove they worked in offensive operations as well. RAF contribution to Alam Halfa's success exceeded artillery or armor. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Coningham's Desert Air Force flew 2,500 sorties during the 6-day battle, attacking German supply columns, bombing assembly areas, strafing, retreating tanks, establishing complete air superiority over the battlefield. Luftwaffe pilots flew 1,500 sorties, outnumbered and outfought, unable to protect German ground forces or contest British air operations. The disparity demonstrated shifting balance of power in the Desert Air War. British aircraft production exceeded German output. Replacement aircraft and pilots arrived steadily. Losses were made good within days. German losses were irreplaceable. Every Messerschmitt destroyed, every experienced pilot killed, represented permanent degradation of Luftwaffe capability in theater. By October, RAF would achieve nearly 3-to-1 numerical superiority. Air dominance so complete that German ground forces operated under constant attack, while British forces moved in daylight without fear of airstrikes. This transformation began at Alam Halfa, where RAF proved air power could be a decisive factor in ground operations. Tank loss statistics from Alam Halfa revealed the defensive advantage's mathematical reality. British forces lost 67 tanks destroyed, Germans 38, Italians 11. Superficially, this suggests close-run battle, relatively equal losses. Reality was completely different. British tanks were recovered from battlefield, repaired in workshops within days, returned to service within weeks. German losses were permanent. Workshop capacity, spare parts, and transportation infrastructure could not support rapid repair. More significantly, British tank strength was increasing. New Sherman tanks arriving from America, older models cascading to training units, operational strength growing even as losses occurred. German tank strength declined inexorably, losses exceeding replacements and repairs combined, operational strength degrading monthly. The loss exchange at Alamein favored Germany tactically, but Britain strategically, unsustainable attrition that Montgomery could afford and Rommel could not. Alamein's psychological impact exceeded its tactical results. For the first time since France in 1940, British forces had fought German armor to stand still in planned defensive battle, executing operational plans successfully, achieving objectives without breakdown or collapse. Soldiers who participated gained confidence in their methods, their equipment, their commanders. Units that hadn't participated heard stories from those who had, second-hand confidence spreading through 8th Army. Montgomery's reputation soared, his promise that new methods would work validated by combat results. German commanders, conversely, faced disturbing realization that British Army was learning, adapting, improving. The defeats that came so easily throughout 1942 would not continue. Rommel personally seemed diminished, his aura of invincibility tarnished, his operational magic failing against methodical planning and overwhelming material superiority. The Desert Fox was becoming an ordinary general, constrained by logistics, defeated by superior resources, reduced to defensive warfare while waiting for inevitable British offensive. Psychologically, strategically, operationally, Alamein shifted momentum decisively. The question was no longer whether British would attack but when, and whether Rommel could survive the coming storm. September gave way to October, with both armies preparing for the decisive battle. Montgomery trained his forces relentlessly, rehearsing the attack that would break Axis lines, refining coordination between arms, accumulating supplies in quantities that dwarfed Rommel's wildest dreams. Rommel reinforced his minefields, thickened his defenses, positioned his remaining armor for counterattack, and calculated how long his logistics could sustain defensive operations. The answer was not encouraging. His Italian infantry divisions were shells, German divisions undermanned, fuel and ammunition critically short. But Hitler's orders were absolute. Hold Egypt, retreat was forbidden, victory or death. Rommel would fight the coming battle from positions he knew were ultimately indefensible, with resources inadequate to task, against enemy whose material superiority grew more overwhelming daily. It was martial suicide disguised as strategic necessity. But soldiers follow orders, generals execute missions, and the Wehrmacht did not surrender easily. When Montgomery attacked in October, Rommel's army would fight with desperate skill, making the British pay for every yard, inflicting casualties that seemed to justify Churchill's impatience with Montgomery's caution. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Alamein proved British Army had learned how to fight. El Alamein would prove they had learned how to win. September 20th, 1942, 0 to 200 hours. German mine-laying position, southern sector. Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt supervises his engineer section, laying teller mines in the darkness, each man moving carefully, placing mines at 3-foot intervals, connecting anti-handling devices that will detonate if anyone attempts removal. His orders call for 5,000 mines in this sector alone, creating a belt 2 kilometers deep, overlaying older British minefields with German patterns, adding anti-personnel S-mines set to spring upward when triggered and explode at waist height. The work is dangerous, exhausting, and mind-numbing in its repetition. Dig shallow hole, place mine, set pressure plate, mark location with white tape, move 3 feet, repeat. Mistakes are instantly fatal. One section loses 2 men to premature detonation, bodies shredded by explosives they were positioning. The section continues working. Morning will bring British air attacks and artillery fire, making mine-laying impossible. Tonight's work must be completed before dawn, regardless of casualties, regardless of exhaustion. Rommel's orders are explicit. Create defensive positions so dense, so lethal, that British attacks drown in minefields before reaching German infantry. Schmidt calculates that his section will lay 300 mines tonight. Across the entire front, German and Italian engineers will lay 10,000. By October, total mine density will reach 500,000 devices, the most heavily mined battlefield in human history, what German propaganda will call Devil's Gardens, and British soldiers will call Hell. Mine warfare at El Alamein evolved from tactical expedient to strategic determinant, transforming desert fighting from fluid mobile operations to attritional nightmare that favored defenders overwhelmingly. The concept was simple. Mines channeled attackers into killing zones where artillery and anti-tank guns waited, slowed advances to walking pace, inflicted casualties continuously without requiring defenders to expose themselves, and created psychological terror among attacking troops who knew that any step might be their last. Implementation required massive effort. British engineers laid 250,000 mines from August through October, creating defensive belts 5 miles deep south of the Alamein position, protecting against Rommel's potential southern envelopment. German engineers laid 450,000 mines in their defensive positions, mixed anti-tank and anti-personnel types, creating interlocking fields where clearing one type exposed engineers to the other. The mathematics of mine clearance were brutal. 8 attack corridors, each 8 feet wide, 6,000 yards deep through 450,000 mines. Engineers calculated 12 hours minimum for clearance, working under artillery fire, accepting 20% casualty rate as inevitable cost of breakthrough operations. British mine types at El Alamein included the Mark V anti-tank mine, 9 pounds of TNT requiring 200 pounds of pressure to detonate, capable of destroying tank tracks or detonating fuel tanks. Anti-personnel mines were German S-mines, captured in earlier operations and laid in British fields, supplemented by improvised devices and booby traps. The British approach emphasized density over sophistication, saturation laying in defensive sectors, creating belts so deep that penetration required hours of continuous clearing rather than quick breaches. German mine laying followed similar philosophy but added refinements. Anti-handling devices that detonated mines if British engineers attempted removal, false patterns suggesting cleared lanes that led into thickened mine concentrations, dummy minefields marked with warning signs in English to suggest presence of mines where none existed. The psychological warfare dimension mattered as much as physical barriers. Soldiers advancing through minefields fought constant fear, every step potentially fatal. Stress accumulating until units refused to advance despite direct orders. Mine warfare's terror was its unpredictability, the way it killed randomly, impersonally, without warning or possibility of defense. Polish engineers serving with British forces developed the first practical mine detectors, sensitive enough to locate buried metal but small enough for one man to carry while sweeping the ground ahead. The detector operator walked slowly, sweeping the device in precise patterns, listening through headphones for the tone change indicating metal beneath sand. When the tone changed, the operator marked the spot with white tape, called forward a second engineer to probe carefully with bayonet, confirmed mine presence, and marked the safe path around it. This process worked but was agonizingly slow, perhaps 100 yards per hour in dense minefields, completely impractical for breakthrough operations requiring rapid advance. The alternative was accepting casualties, sending infantry forward to detonate mines through sheer numbers, or employing mechanical clearing devices like the Scorpion mine flail tank. The Scorpion mounted rotating chains on a drum ahead of the tank, chains flailing the ground and detonating mines through kinetic impact. The concept was sound. Implementation was problematic. Mechanical failures were common, flail speed limited to 1.5 miles per hour, and tanks presented perfect targets for German anti-tank guns while slowly flailing through minefields. October 23rd, breakthrough night. British engineers advanced into German minefields following the opening artillery barrage, sweeping detectors while shells screamed overhead, marking lanes with white tape that had to remain visible in darkness and dust. German machine gun fire raked the engineers, artillery shells sought the concentrations of men. But the work continued because, without cleared lanes, armor could not advance, and, without armor, infantry could not hold captured positions. Engineers suffered catastrophic casualties, entire sections wiped out, survivors continuing the mission because the mission was everything. One Royal Engineer Company entered the minefield with 87 men. Dawn found 23 effectives remaining, the others dead, wounded, or evacuated with psychiatric breakdowns from stress. The cleared lanes extended 4,000 yards, roughly two-thirds of the required depth, inadequate for armor exploitation, but sufficient for infantry consolidation. The engineers' sacrifice enabled the breakthrough, their willingness to walk slowly through explosive gardens while under fire, representing courage so extraordinary that it becomes difficult to comprehend from peacetime perspective. Mine clearance failures plagued breakthrough operations as much as successes. First Armored Division's advance stalled when lead tanks triggered undetected mines in supposedly cleared lanes, blocking passage for following vehicles. Traffic jams developed immediately, hundreds of tanks nose to tail in 8-foot-wide corridors, unable to maneuver, perfect targets for German artillery that had pre-registered every likely penetration point. Tank commanders who attempted to bypass blockages by leaving marked lanes struck mines immediately, their vehicles destroyed, the lesson clear: stay in lane or die. The clearance failure was not primarily engineering incompetence, but rather the mathematical impossibility of clearing perfectly under combat conditions. German minefields were simply too dense, too deep, too well integrated with supporting fires. British engineers achieved perhaps 95% clearance effectiveness, but 5% remaining mines and 450,000 minefields left 22,500 active devices. Given tank dimensions and spacing, probability of striking undetected mine approached certainty during any sustained advance. The breakthrough succeeded despite mine clearance failures, not because of perfect clearance. The legacy of El Alamein's mine warfare extended decades beyond the battle. Post-war mine clearance operations continued through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. By the 1980s, Egypt estimated that 17 million mines remained scattered across the Western Desert from Second World War operations, most locations unmarked, maps lost, or never created. Bedouin shepherds triggered mines regularly. Children playing in the desert died from explosions. Farmers plowing land detonated devices buried 40 years earlier. The human cost continued long after the soldiers departed. Innocent civilians paying for military expedients employed when winning the war seemed to justify any method. El Alamein's mine warfare pioneered techniques still employed 8 decades later. Mixed mine types to complicate clearance, anti-handling devices to kill engineers, dense saturation, laying to create impassable barriers. Modern militaries studied El Alamein's lessons, refined the tactics, created more sophisticated mines, and ensured that the legacy of mine warfare continued to kill long after conflicts ended. British innovation in mine warfare extended to marking and recording. Unlike German forces, who often laid mines without recording locations, British engineers mapped every minefield meticulously, marking boundaries on military maps, recording mine types and densities, creating archives that would enable post-war clearance. The practice reflected different military cultures. German emphasis on immediate tactical effect, regardless of long-term consequences, versus British concern for systematic documentation, even in combat conditions. Neither approach was morally superior. Both resulted in thousands of mines that would never be recovered, permanent contamination of battlefields, and decades of civilian casualties. The careful British records proved of limited value when 8th Army advanced westward, leaving marked minefields in their wake for Axis forces to navigate, a role reversal that demonstrated how mine warfare's consequences outlasted tactical objectives. October's mine warfare casualties exceeded 2,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers, 8% of total battle losses from operations on 0.3% of battlefield terrain. The disproportion revealed mine warfare's efficiency from defenders' perspective. Relatively small number of mines, laid by relatively few engineers, generated casualties disproportionate to effort invested. From attackers' perspective, the calculus was reversed. massive resources devoted to clearance, enormous casualties accepted, all to create narrow corridors through obstacles that defenders created cheaply and quickly. This asymmetry explains why mine warfare became standard defensive practice, why armies devoted increasing resources to mine laying, why later conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan featured even more extensive mining than El Alamein. The lessons seemed clear. Mines worked, mines killed, mines channeled attackers into killing zones. The longer-term lessons, the decades of civilian casualties, the permanent landscape contamination, the humanitarian catastrophe, those lessons took longer to learn and are still being learned in former war zones worldwide. The Devil's Gardens at El Alamein represented industrialized warfare's application to landmines, mass production techniques applied to explosive devices, saturation, coverage of terrain, acceptance of long-term environmental consequences for short-term tactical advantage. 500,000 mines at El Alamein dwarfed previous mine warfare, but represented only the beginning of escalation that would continue through the Cold War. Future conflicts would feature millions of mines, entire nations contaminated, generations of civilians maimed. But in October 1942, these consequences remained invisible, theoretical, someone else's problem for some future date. Tonight, engineers on both sides focused on immediate tactical mission. British clearing lanes for armor exploitation, Germans laying more mines to slow that exploitation, neither side considering that their work would kill children 50 years later. The Devil's Gardens were growing, and the harvest would continue long after the soldiers who planted them turned to dust. September 15th, 1942. 8th Army Tactical Headquarters, Burg El Arab, Egypt. Montgomery stands before a map table surrounded by his corps commanders, outlining the operational concept that will guide the coming offensive. His pointer traces northern sector, indicating the coastline where Australian 9th Division holds positions, sweeping southward through XXX Corps sector, where Highland Division and New Zealand Division will attack, continuing to 13th Corps holding southern positions. The plan is called Operation Lightfoot, a sardonic reference to infantry advancing through minefields, and it represents Montgomery's complete operational philosophy. Overwhelming force applied methodically at a decisive point. No clever maneuvers, no brilliant improvisation, just brutal application of material superiority until enemy positions collapse. We will not attempt breakthrough in the traditional sense. Montgomery explains to commanders who have heard similar briefings precede disastrous failures. We will crumble the enemy, destroy his infantry divisions systematically, isolate his armor, and force him to fight at a tactical disadvantage. Corps commanders exchange glances, uncertain whether this methodical approach will succeed where previous plans failed, but Montgomery's confidence is absolute. He has trained this army, reorganized its structure, accumulated supplies in quantities that seem impossible, and planned every detail of the coming attack. The 8th Army is ready. The question is whether Rommel is ready to be destroyed. Montgomery's crumbling concept represented fundamental departure from traditional breakthrough doctrine. Previous British attacks sought penetration point, where armor could exploit into open ground behind enemy lines, racing to cut supply routes and force retreating enemy to abandon equipment. This concept failed repeatedly in desert warfare, because German anti-tank guns destroyed British armor faster than infantry could suppress the guns. Coordination failures left armor unsupported, and German operational mobility allowed counterattacks that cut off penetrating forces. Montgomery rejected the entire framework. Instead of breakthrough, he planned systematic destruction of Axis infantry divisions, the Italian formations that provided bulk of Rommel's combat power. Once Italian divisions were eliminated, German armor would be isolated without infantry support, forced to defend static positions where German tactical mobility advantages were neutralized. Then British armor could fight on favorable terms, superior numbers gradually wearing down outnumbered German tanks. The concept required patience, willingness to accept high casualties in infantry units that would do the actual crumbling, and confidence that British material superiority would ultimately prove decisive. Montgomery had all three. September through October witnessed unprecedented supply accumulation, logistics buildup on scale the Western Desert had never seen. By October 20th, British supply dumps contained 1 million artillery shells for opening barrage, 3 million gallons of petrol for vehicle operations, 100,000 tons of ammunition in stores, 600 ambulances for casualty evacuation, and sufficient food stocks for 3 months of operations. British tank strength peaked at 1,029 operational vehicles, including 300 Sherman tanks. Recently arrived from America, 100 Crusaders from Britain, and 629 Grant and Valentine tanks from various sources. The Sherman represented technological revolution. 75mm gun capable of penetrating German armor at 2,000 yards. 3-inch frontal armor resistant to most German anti-tank weapons. 25 miles per hour speed adequate for exploitation operations. Shermans would equip the armored brigades tasked with exploitation following infantry breakthrough, giving British armor qualitative parity with German panzers for the first time in the Desert War. October 20th, final intelligence summary delivered to Montgomery's headquarters confirmed every German and Italian unit's location, strength, and capability. The intelligence was extraordinary in detail and accuracy, product of ultra-decrypts, RAF, reconnaissance photography, patrol reports, prisoner interrogations, and signals intelligence from German radio traffic. Montgomery knew that Rommel commanded 104,000 troops, including 54,000 German, 489 tanks, including 278 German, and 1,219 artillery pieces. He knew that Italian divisions were combat ineffective, German divisions were under strength, and Axis logistics were catastrophically inadequate. He knew that Rommel was in Germany on medical leave, that General Georg Stumme temporarily commanded the Panzer Army, and that German commanders expected British attack in early November rather than late October. The intelligence advantage was overwhelming, nearly perfect knowledge of enemy dispositions, capabilities, and intentions. Montgomery's staff officers joked that they knew more about German positions than German commanders did, and the joke was nearly true. Deception operations supported the operational plan, convincing German intelligence that British attack would target southern sector in mid-November. Dummy tanks, constructed from canvas and wood, were concentrated in southern sector, convincingly realistic from aerial reconnaissance. Radio traffic simulated armored divisions preparing for southern offensive. Construction of a water pipeline towards southern positions suggested British were preparing logistics infrastructure for November operations. The pipeline deliberately built at pace, suggesting completion date in mid-November. German aerial reconnaissance photographed the deceptions. German intelligence analyzed the indicators, and German operational planning responded exactly as Montgomery intended. Rommel positioned his reserves to counterattack southern sector penetration, leaving northern sector where actual attack would fall relatively weakly defended. The deception was so successful that German commanders remained convinced that northern attack was merely fixing operation. Real breakthrough would come in south, even after fighting had commenced in north. Artillery fire planning reached unprecedented sophistication under Brigadier Sidney Kirkman's coordination. 882 guns would participate in opening barrage, more concentrated firepower than any previous desert operation, organized into 3 phases. Counter-battery fire to suppress German artillery, area bombardment of defensive positions to destroy fortifications and kill defenders, and creeping barrage to protect advancing infantry. The mathematics were staggering. 1 million shells in first 5 days required coordinating fire from 28 artillery regiments, ensuring ammunition supply to every battery, preventing fratricide from shells falling short, and maintaining firing rates that would exhaust gun barrels and necessitate barrel changes mid-operation. Kirkman's staff calculated that each 25-pounder gun would fire 600 rounds the first night, sustaining 4 rounds per minute for extended periods. Rate of fire unprecedented in desert warfare. Gun crews practiced ammunition handling until they could maintain firing rates in darkness, under simulated counter-battery fire, with mechanical efficiency that would enable sustained barrage. Infantry training emphasized night operations and combined arms coordination. 51st Highland Division, chosen to lead northern sector attack, rehearsed assault near Berg el Arab, creating mock German defenses with wire, mines, and fortified positions. Battalions practiced advancing behind timed artillery barrage, companies maintaining formation in darkness, platoons maintaining direction using compass bearings and directional lamps. The rehearsals continued through September and into October. Endless repetition of night advance, mine clearance, assault through wire, consolidation on objectives, coordination with supporting armor. Soldiers complained about the repetitive training, questioned whether this attack would be different from previous failures, but gradually developed confidence that this time someone had thought through the plan, prepared properly, accumulated resources necessary for success. By October 20th, the Highland Division believed they would succeed. Crucial psychological advantage earned through competent training and visible material superiority. Montgomery's refusal to attack before he was ready frustrated Churchill continuously through September and October. The Prime Minister sent increasingly urgent cables demanding immediate offensive, arguing that delay allowed Rommel to strengthen defenses, questioning whether Montgomery possessed the aggressive spirit necessary for command. Montgomery replied calmly that attacking before prepared would replicate previous disasters, that one more defeat would destroy Eighth Army's morale permanently, and that he would attack when ready and not before. Alexander supported Montgomery, providing political cover against Churchill's pressure, allowing the methodical preparation to continue. The exchange revealed fundamental tension between political necessity and military reality. Churchill needed victory immediately for political reasons. Montgomery needed victory absolutely for military reasons. And the two timelines were incompatible. Montgomery won the bureaucratic battle because Alexander trusted him and Churchill had no alternative commander. But the tension remained unresolved, surfacing repeatedly when Montgomery's cautious exploitation after breakthrough frustrated Churchill's expectations of annihilating pursuit. October 22nd, Final Commanders Conference. Montgomery briefed the plan one last time, emphasizing key points: breakthrough in northern sector through Axis minefields, infantry to establish bridgehead 6,000 yards deep, armor to pass through and engage German reserves, systematic crumbling of Italian infantry divisions, no hasty exploitation until conditions favored decisive armored action. Corps commanders asked final questions, verified artillery support timing, confirmed boundary lines between divisions, synchronized watches to ensure perfect coordination. The atmosphere was confident, professional, utterly different from previous operations where confusion and uncertainty characterized planning. Eighth Army had transformed from defeated rabble to professional military organization, trained, equipped, and confident. Everything possible had been done to ensure success. The outcome depended now on soldiers' courage, commanders' competence, and whether Rommel's wounded army could mount effective defense against overwhelming assault. 24 hours remained. Then the artillery would speak, and the Second Battle of El Alamein would begin. October 23, 1942, 21:40 hours. British artillery position, northern sector. Gunner Thomas Richards of the 25th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, stands beside his 25-pounder gun, checking ammunition stores one final time before the barrage begins. His crew has prepared 600 rounds per gun, shells stacked in neat pyramids beside each weapon, fuses checked, propelling charges arranged for rapid firing. Around him, 882 guns wait in the gathering darkness. Crews tense, officers checking watches. Everyone aware that in exactly 0 minutes, the largest artillery barrage in desert warfare history will commence. The target is the German-Italian defensive line, 40 miles of prepared positions, minefields, strong points, and artillery positions. The mission is simple: destroy those defenses so completely that British infantry can advance through the wreckage, overrun survivors, and create gaps for armor exploitation. Richards's gun will fire approximately 600 rounds tonight, perhaps 800 if mechanical failures don't occur. Every shell hand-loaded, every firing decision made, every aiming adjustment calculated while under German counter-battery fire. The gun captain raises his arm. 20 seconds. Richards's hands grip the next shell. 10 seconds. The night is about to become day. 5 seconds. Then the world explodes. 21:40 hours exactly. 882 guns fire simultaneously, creating sound beyond human experience. physical pressure that compresses chests and makes breathing difficult. The flash illuminates the desert like noon sun. Then darkness returns fractionally before the next salvo. The guns fire in continuous ripple, never more than seconds between volleys, creating constant thunder that continues without pause. 60 miles away in Alexandria, residents hear the barrage, windows rattling from concussion, uncertain whether sound is artillery or distant storm. At British headquarters, Montgomery watches the horizon glow orange and red, listens to the continuous thunder, knows that his artillery is doing exactly what he planned. In German positions, the receiving end experiences hell. Shells arrive in continuous stream, high explosive, fragmenting into razor shards that slice through sandbags, fortifications, human bodies. Communications, trenches collapse, burying men alive. Artillery observation posts disintegrate, commanders killed before they can call fire missions against British guns. Counter-battery fire becomes impossible because German gunners cannot survive long enough to aim their weapons, cannot calculate firing solutions while ground trembles and shells explode continuously around them. The opening phase targeted German artillery positions, counter-battery fire designed to suppress enemy guns before they could interfere with British infantry advance. Royal Artillery had identified every German battery position through aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence, creating target folders with precise coordinates. British guns fired concentration missions, massing 3 or 4 regiments fire on single German battery, overwhelming position with hundreds of shells in minutes. German gunners died at their weapons, unable to fire back, unable to retreat, simply enduring until shells found them. The counter-battery phase lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes of concentrated destruction that eliminated 75% of German artillery capability before the barrage shifted to area bombardment. The German guns that survived were suppressed, crews unwilling to expose themselves, commanders unable to communicate with subordinate batteries. German artillery rendered combat ineffective before British infantry began their advance. The counter-battery success was extraordinary, product of detailed intelligence, massive firepower, and ruthless execution. Rommel's army would fight the coming battle without effective artillery support, critical disadvantage that shaped every subsequent engagement. Area bombardment phase commenced 21:55 hours, barrage shifting from German artillery positions to forward defensive zones. The target was Italian infantry divisions, specifically the Trento and Bologna divisions holding the northern sector, where British main effort would strike. For 5.5 hours, British shells rained on Italian positions, high explosive rounds demolishing fortifications, fragmenting on hard ground to create deadly shrapnel, destroying wire obstacles, detonating minefields, and killing defenders. The psychological effect exceeded physical destruction. Italian soldiers huddled in bunkers, listening to shells screaming overhead, feeling earth shake with every explosion, knowing that nothing they could do would stop the bombardment, that their survival depended entirely on whether a shell happened to land directly on their position. Some went mad, gibbering in corners, unable to respond to officers' orders. Others deserted, fleeing rearward through minefields, accepting risk of instant death from mines over the certainty of death from prolonged bombardment. The Italian divisions were breaking before British infantry ever reached their positions. 0100 hours, the creeping barrage began. This was the supreme test of artillery coordination, requiring precise timing, perfect execution, and absolute trust between infantry and gunners. The barrage lifted from German frontline positions and advanced at 100 yards every 3 minutes, moving inland at walking pace. British infantry followed 50 yards behind the explosion line, maintaining formation despite dust, smoke, and enemy fire. The coordination required infantry companies to advance at precisely calculated speed. Too fast, and they ran into their own artillery fire. Too slow, and German defenders recovered from bombardment before infantry arrived. Casualties from friendly fire occurred when units lost direction in darkness, when barrages lifted early due to faulty timing, when exhausted soldiers stumbled forward faster than intended. But the creeping barrage worked, suppressing German defenders until British infantry were literally on top of positions, grenades flying into trenches before defenders could organize resistance. The creeping barrage innovation had been developed in First World War, refined through decades of training, and now applied with industrial efficiency to desert warfare. The 25-pounder gun proved ideal for desert warfare, combining adequate range, sustained firing rate, reliability under harsh conditions, and flexible ammunition options. The gun could fire high-explosive shells against infantry and fortifications, armor-piercing shot against tanks at close range, smoke rounds for concealment, and illumination rounds for night operations. Sustained firing rate of 4 rounds per minute could be maintained for hours, crews working with practiced efficiency, loaders and rammers operating in smooth rhythm even while exhausted. Range of 13,400 yards enabled 25-pounders to engage targets well beyond infantry's visual range, providing support throughout breakthrough phase. British artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires, concentration of multiple batteries on single target, creating weight of fire that overwhelmed defenses regardless of individual shell accuracy. The doctrine required centralized fire control, sophisticated communications, and highly trained forward observers, all of which 8th Army had developed through Montgomery's training revolution. Ammunition expenditure during opening barrage exceeded peacetime imagining. Each 25-pounder fired 600 rounds the first night, sustained rate that required continuous ammunition supply from forward dumps to gun positions. Ammunition trucks shuttled continuously, delivering shells and returning for more loads, drivers navigating in darkness while German shells searched for supply routes. The logistics of artillery warfare were staggering. 1 million shells fired in 5 days required stockpiling ammunition for months, transporting it forward to dumps, then distributing to batteries during combat operations. Each shell weighed approximately 25 pounds, including propellant charge, meaning 1 million shells represented 12,500 tons of munitions that had to be manufactured in Britain, shipped across the Atlantic and around Africa, unloaded at Egyptian ports, transported to forward areas, and delivered to guns during sustained combat. The British Empire's industrial capacity enabled this expenditure. Germany's and Italy's did not. The artillery barrage represented application of overwhelming material superiority, Britain's factories outproducing Axis factories by ratios that made battlefield outcome mathematically certain. German soldiers who survived the opening barrage described it as the worst experience of their lives, exceeding anything experienced on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery was famously devastating. The continuous nature of the bombardment, hours without respite, created psychological damage that lingered long after physical injuries healed. German unit commanders reported that many soldiers were combat ineffective after the barrage, refusing to leave dugouts, unable to respond to orders, psychologically broken by sustained artillery fire. Italian units suffered even worse, entire battalions disintegrating, soldiers fleeing or surrendering en masse rather than endure more bombardment. The German High Command's post-battle analysis concluded that British artillery superiority was a decisive factor in Axis defeat, that no amount of tactical skill or operational brilliance could overcome such massive firepower disparity. Rommel himself acknowledged that his infantry, German and Italian alike, could not sustain defense against artillery concentrations of such intensity and duration. 25 pounds of explosive per shell, multiplied by 1 million shells, equals 12.5 million pounds of high explosive, delivered onto 40 miles of defensive positions over 5 days. The mathematics of industrial warfare reduced combat to demolition, systematic destruction of enemy positions through overwhelming firepower. Infantry casualties occurred, artillery pieces were destroyed, vehicles burned, but the primary effect was psychological. Defenders who survived knew they could not win. That British material superiority was so overwhelming that resistance merely delayed inevitable defeat. The barrage broke Axis morale as effectively as it broke defensive positions. When British infantry reached German lines, many defenders surrendered immediately, surrendered eagerly, willing to trade imprisonment for end of bombardment. Others fought with desperate courage, knowing defeat was certain, but fighting anyway from duty or loyalty or simple inability to accept the inevitable. The barrage made victory possible, but not automatic. British infantry still had to advance through minefields, under fire, assault prepared positions, overcome defenders who refused to quit. The artillery created conditions for success. Infantry had to achieve success through courage and skill. The next phase of Operation Lightfoot was about to begin. October 23, 1942, 2200 hours. Northern Sector, British start line. Corporal Ian Fraser of the 51st Highland Division fixes his bayonet, checks his rifle one final time, and waits for the signal to advance. Behind him, the artillery barrage continues its thunderous work, shells screaming overhead toward German positions 6,000 yards distant. Ahead, darkness conceals minefields, wire obstacles, machine gun nests, and Italian defenders, who have endured 2 hours of bombardment and now wait with equal dread for the infantry assault they know is coming. Fraser's battalion will advance in line, 4 companies abreast, maintaining formation through minefields using compass bearings and directional lamps, following 50 yards behind the creeping barrage that is supposed to protect them from enemy fire. The theory sounds simple. The reality will be chaos, confusion, and terror punctuated by moments of extraordinary violence. 2200 hours exactly, whistles blow along the start line. Pipers begin playing Highland Laddie, the traditional regimental march, music audible even over artillery fire. Fraser steps forward into the darkness, into the barrage, into the minefields, and into history. The Highland Division's advance became legendary. Kilted soldiers marching into machine gun fire while pipers played, maintaining formation despite casualties, pressing forward with clan pride and professional discipline. But legend obscures reality. The advance was not parade ground precision, but controlled chaos. Companies losing contact with neighbors in darkness and dust. Platoons navigating by compass bearing when visual references disappeared. Individual soldiers maintaining direction by following the man ahead and hoping he knew where he was going. The artillery barrage helped and hindered simultaneously. Shells falling ahead suppressed German defensive fire, but explosions created dust clouds that reduced visibility to yards, made breathing difficult, disoriented, advancing troops. Some companies advanced too quickly, running into their own barrage, suffering casualties from friendly fire. Others advanced too slowly, allowing Germans to recover from bombardment and establish defensive fire before British infantry arrived. Despite confusion, the Highland Division reached most objectives by 0 to 400 hours, overrunning Italian positions, capturing hundreds of prisoners, establishing bridgehead for armor exploitation. Australian 9th Division's assault on the coastal sector demonstrated combined arms warfare executed with professional competence. Australian infantry had trained extensively with British armor and artillery, developing mutual understanding and shared tactical vocabulary that other formations lacked. Their assault objectives included Thompson's Post, a fortified position held by German troops who had survived the artillery barrage and now defended with characteristic skill. Australian companies approached under covering fire from supporting tanks, infantry, and armor, communicating by radio, coordinating movement and fire. When Australian infantry went to ground under German machine gun fire, supporting tanks engaged German positions with 75mm guns, suppressing defenders long enough for infantry to advance. When tanks encountered anti-tank guns, infantry provided covering fire while tanks withdrew to hull down positions. The coordination was not perfect. Casualties occurred from friendly fire and coordination failures, but Australian success rate exceeded other divisions because they fought as integrated team rather than separate arms. Mine clearance during the assault phase revealed the human cost of technological warfare. Royal Engineers advanced with infantry, sweeping mine detectors while under fire, marking cleared lanes with white tape that glowed faintly in darkness. German machine gunners targeted the engineers specifically, recognizing that stopping mine clearance stopped the entire assault. Engineer casualties reached appalling levels. Entire sections wiped out. Survivors continuing the mission because, without cleared lanes, armor could not advance and infantry could not be resupplied. One engineer section from the 2nd Armored Brigade clearing party entered the minefield with 12 men. Dawn found 3 survivors, the others dead or wounded, but their lane extended 4,000 yards into German positions, exactly as required. The survivors continued working, mechanically sweeping and marking, too exhausted and traumatized to feel fear anymore, operating on training and muscle memory alone. Their courage was not heroic gesture, but simple refusal to quit, continuation of mission despite overwhelming casualties, determination that characterized the entire British assault. New Zealand Division's attack on Materia Ridge illustrated the problems that plagued British operations, despite improved training and preparation. The division attacked at night, achieved complete surprise, overran Italian defenders, and captured the ridge by 0 to 400 hours. Success seemed total. Then, coordination failures cascaded. British armor was supposed to pass through New Zealand positions at dawn, but the 23rd Armored Brigade lost direction in darkness, arrived hours late, and advanced without coordinating with New Zealand infantry. German 88mm anti-tank guns engaged the unsupported British tanks, destroying dozens before the brigade withdrew. New Zealand infantry on Materia Ridge, now isolated without armor support, faced German counterattack at mid-morning. 15th Panzer Division's veteran tank crews assaulted the ridge, engaging New Zealand anti-tank guns in close-range duel, eventually forcing New Zealand withdrawal when ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. By evening, Materia Ridge was back in German hands, another British success squandered through coordination failure. South African and Indian divisions in the southern sector faced different challenges. Their attacks were deliberate fixing operations, designed to prevent German reserves from reinforcing the northern sector where the main effort struck. The attacks had to appear genuine, threatening enough that German commanders committed reserves to defend, but not so costly that British casualties exceeded operational necessity. South African infantry advanced through minefields under less intensive artillery support than northern attacks, facing German defensive fire without the overwhelming suppression that helped Highland and Australian divisions. Casualties were significant but not catastrophic. Objectives were partially achieved, sufficient to convince German commanders that southern sector represented serious threat. The attacks succeeded in their strategic purpose, pinning German reserves, but at cost that troubled commanders who sent men forward, knowing the attacks were designed to fail strategically in order to succeed operationally elsewhere. War's mathematics sometimes required sacrificing soldiers to fix enemy attention, brutal calculus that separated competent commanders from emotional ones. Dawn, October 24th, brought British assessment of the night's operations. 4 of 8 mine lanes were inadequately cleared, extending only 4,000 yards rather than required 6,000, blocked by destroyed tanks and uncleared mines. Infantry held most objectives in the northern sector, but were isolated, vulnerable to German counterattack, desperate for armor support that had not arrived. Casualties totaled approximately 2,500 Commonwealth troops in 12 hours of fighting, concentrated in assault infantry battalions that suffered 40 to 60% losses in some companies. Tank losses were lighter than feared, perhaps 50 tanks destroyed or disabled, but traffic jams in mine lanes prevented armor from reaching exploitation positions. The assessment was mixed. Breakthrough achieved but incomplete, infantry successful but unsupported, coordination improved but still inadequate. Montgomery faced decision: continue attacking despite incomplete success, pause to reorganize, or shift to different approach. He ordered continued attacks, believing that systematic pressure would eventually break Axis resistance. German counterattacks began immediately after dawn, 15th Panzer Division, advancing against Highland Division positions, attempting to destroy the bridgehead before British armor could exploit. The counterattacks met devastating defensive fire. British 25-pounder guns engaging German tanks at maximum range, RAF fighter bombers attacking from above, and Highland Division anti-tank guns fighting from prepared positions. German tank losses mounted quickly, tactical skill insufficient against overwhelming firepower. By mid-morning, the counterattack stalled, German commanders recognizing that frontal assaults against prepared British positions replicated British mistakes from previous operations. The counterattacks shifted to containment, establishing defensive line to prevent British exploitation rather than attempting to restore original positions. The shift revealed German operational reality: insufficient strength to counterattack successfully, barely adequate strength to defend, entirely inadequate strength to sustain prolonged battle against British material superiority. The infantry's night established the operational pattern for the entire battle. British attacks would be methodical, systematic, grinding, accepting high casualties to achieve limited objectives, then consolidating before next phase. German defenses would be skillful, determined, ultimately inadequate against overwhelming British advantages in artillery, air power, and reserves. The breakthrough concept that dominated British planning proved unrealistic. There would be no clean penetration, no armor racing through gaps into open desert, no operational level exploitation. Instead, the battle would be attritional, infantry grinding through defensive positions, armor fighting, limited engagements to support infantry rather than conducting independent operations. This was not the mobile warfare that characterized previous desert fighting, but positional warfare resembling the Western Front, victory through exhaustion rather than maneuver. Montgomery recognized the reality quickly, adjusted his expectations, and prepared for the crumbling operations that would systematically destroy Axis infantry divisions and isolate German armor. The infantry had done their part, creating the conditions for crumbling. Now came the hard part, sustaining operations until Axis resistance collapsed completely. British soldiers who survived the breakthrough night described it as the hardest fighting they experienced in the entire war, harder than anything that followed in Tunisia, Italy, or Northwest Europe. The combination of night navigation through minefields, sustained artillery fire, close quarters combat in German trenches, and constant fear of stepping on mines created stress that broke many soldiers psychologically. Psychiatric casualties during breakthrough night exceeded 500 men, soldiers who simply stopped functioning, unable to advance, unable to retreat, frozen by fear or trauma. Medical officers evacuated them to rear areas where most recovered within days, but some never returned to frontline service, permanently damaged by the night's experiences. The breakthrough succeeded, objectives were taken, German defenses were penetrated, but the human cost was staggering. Every infantry battalion that participated emerged at reduced strength, depleted by casualties, exhausted by sustained combat, requiring rest and reorganization before they could fight again. Montgomery's plan called for continuous operations, sustained pressure, unrelenting attacks. The infantry who had to execute those attacks knew that the breakthrough night was just the beginning, that more nights like that were coming, and that survival was largely a matter of luck rather than skill or courage. October 24th, 1942, 0 to 200 hours, Mine Lane Charlie, 4,000 yards into German positions. Major Robert Crisp of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment watches his lead tank strike a mine with sickening crunch of metal on explosive, tank tracks blown apart, vehicle immobilized in the middle of the 8-foot-wide cleared lane. Behind him, 300 tanks of 1st Armored Division wait in column, nose to tail, unable to bypass the destroyed vehicle, unable to reverse through the compressed formation behind them. German artillery begins falling, shells walking up and down the lane, methodical destruction of trapped vehicles. Crisp's radio crackles with reports from other lanes. More mines, more traffic jams, more tanks destroyed while stationary. The exploitation phase, the armor breakthrough that was supposed to complete the infantry's success, is dying in the minefields before it ever begins. Visibility is zero. Dust from artillery barrage has not settled. Moonlight creates shadows that look like tank hulls. Commanders cannot determine if they are on course or lost. The entire carefully planned operation is dissolving into chaos, and dawn is 3 hours away. If 1st Armored Division cannot reach exploitation positions before daylight, German anti-tank guns will massacre them in open ground. Crisp orders his tank to attempt bypassing the destroyed vehicle by leaving the marked lane. His driver advances 3 yards before striking another mine. The tank lurches to halt, track broken, vehicle immobilized. The traffic jam is now total. X-Corp's inability to navigate the cleared lanes represented systemic failure rather than individual incompetence. The lanes were too narrow, 8 feet wide for vehicles, 12 feet wide with tracks extending beyond hull, leaving margins measured in inches. Night navigation through dust required precision, impossible to achieve when drivers could not see lane markers, commanders could not determine position, and following vehicles pushed forward regardless of conditions ahead. British doctrine assumed that mine clearance would be complete, that lanes would extend full depth to exploitation positions, and that traffic control would prevent congestion. All 3 assumptions proved false. Mine clearance achieved perhaps 90% effectiveness, leaving scattered mines that destroyed lead vehicles. Lanes extended only 4,000 yards, rather than 6,000, forcing tanks to advance through partially cleared areas where mines remained. Traffic control broke down immediately, tanks entering lanes before previous vehicles cleared them, creating compression that prevented maneuver when obstacles appeared. The result was predictable: gridlock, confusion, and catastrophic vulnerability. German artillery crews had pre-registered every likely mine lane location, calculating coordinates during defensive preparations, preparing fire missions that could be executed on command. When British tanks entered the lanes, concentrated in narrow corridors unable to maneuver, German gunners opened fire with devastating accuracy. Shells walked through the packed formations, each round destroying or disabling a tank. Survivors unable to take cover because departing marked lanes meant certain mine strikes. British tank losses in the lanes exceeded 100 vehicles in 4 hours, more casualties than any previous single engagement in the Desert War. The losses were not primarily from tank versus tank combat, where British crews could employ tactics and gunnery skill, but from artillery fire against stationary targets, where tactical competence meant nothing, and survival was pure chance. Tank commanders radioed increasingly desperate reports to Corps headquarters: lanes blocked, casualties mounting, unable to advance or withdraw, requesting permission to abandon exploitation attempt. Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, ex-Corps commander, reached headquarters at 0 to 800 hours to confront Montgomery about the disaster unfolding in the minefields. Lumsden was an armored warfare purist, believer in mobile operations and maneuver, contemptuous of infantry-centric doctrine that treated tanks as infantry support weapons rather than independent operational force. He argued forcefully that continuing the attack would destroy ex-Corps without achieving objectives, that tactical pause was necessary to reorganize, clear lanes properly, and resume operations under favorable conditions. Montgomery listened, then refused. His orders were explicit. Ex-Corps would push through regardless of losses, establishing armored presence beyond minefields by nightfall, accepting whatever casualties were necessary. The confrontation revealed fundamental disagreement about armor's proper employment. Lumsden believed tanks should fight mobile battles in open ground, exploiting breakthrough rather than creating it. Montgomery believed armor must accept losses to support infantry breakthrough, functioning as mobile artillery and anti-tank reserve rather than independent strike force. Neither was entirely wrong, but Montgomery commanded and his view prevailed. The traffic jam problem extended beyond tactical incompetence to doctrinal failure. British military doctrine kept armor and infantry in separate divisions, armor concentrated in armored divisions, infantry in infantry divisions, the two arms meeting on battlefield as strangers. German doctrine integrated them at division level, panzer divisions combining tanks, motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and engineers under unified command. The integration meant German armor never operated without supporting infantry to clear anti-tank guns, engineers to breach obstacles, artillery to suppress defensive fires. British armor advanced alone, expected infantry to have completed all preparatory work. Found reality did not match expectations. XXX Corps' infantry divisions created the bridgehead but could not clear mines completely, establish secure corridors, or provide the support that armor required for successful exploitation. X-Corps' armored divisions attempted to exploit but lacked infantry to deal with obstacles, engineers to clear additional mines, or doctrine that allowed them to coordinate effectively with XXX Corps. The organizational separation guaranteed coordination failures. October 24th through 25th represented operational pause rather than renewed offensive, both sides consolidating positions, assessing damage, planning next moves. Montgomery recognized that the exploitation phase had failed, that armor would not reach open ground behind German lines, that the battle would be attritional rather than decisive breakthrough. He adjusted his operational approach accordingly, shifting emphasis from exploitation to crumbling, accepting that systematic destruction of Axis infantry divisions would require days or weeks rather than hours. The adjustment demonstrated Montgomery's operational flexibility, willingness to recognize when initial plan was not working, and adapt to battlefield reality. Churchill, reading reports in London, was furious, demanding immediate resumption of offensive, questioning whether Montgomery possessed aggressive spirit necessary for command. Montgomery ignored the pressure, focused on what was achievable rather than what politicians wanted, and prepared for the systematic crumbling operations that would win the battle through attrition rather than maneuver. German commanders, watching British confusion from their positions, experienced mixture of relief and concern. Relief because the expected breakthrough had not materialized. Concern because British material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical victories could not prevent strategic defeat. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, commanding the Africa Corps, reported to Stumm that German tank losses were sustainable, British attacks had been contained, defensive line remained intact. But Italian divisions were disintegrating, German units were exhausted, ammunition was critically low, and fuel reserves were sufficient for perhaps 3 days of defensive operations. Von Thoma's assessment was professionally accurate and strategically depressing. Axis forces could defend successfully in tactical engagements, but could not sustain defense indefinitely against enemy who could replace every loss within days, while Axis losses were permanent. The mathematics of attrition favored Britain so completely that tactical skill merely delayed inevitable defeat. The mine lane failures revealed limitations of British engineering capabilities under combat conditions. Royal Engineers had achieved extraordinary results, clearing paths through 500,000 mines while under fire, but perfect clearance was impossible when working at night, under artillery fire, with inadequate equipment. The Polish-designed mine detectors worked well against metal-cased mines, but missed non-metallic mines entirely. The Scorpion flail tanks broke down frequently, operated too slowly, and presented perfect targets for German anti-tank guns. Manual clearance using bayonets was effective but agonizingly slow, requiring hours to clear lanes that armor needed to traverse in minutes. British engineering simply lacked technological solutions adequate to the problem. The Germans faced similar limitations in reverse. They could lay mines quickly, but could not prevent British clearance, could not replace expended mines, and could not maintain minefield integrity under sustained artillery bombardment that detonated mines wholesale. Mine warfare at El Alamein reached technological ceiling beyond which neither side could advance with 1942 capabilities. By October 25th evening, British armored divisions had established limited presence beyond the minefields. Not the exploitation force that Doctrine required, but sufficient armor to prevent German counterattacks from destroying infantry bridgehead. 1st Armored Division occupied positions 3,000 yards beyond original start line. 2nd Armored Division held ground in the northern sector, and 10th Armored Division covered southern approaches. None had achieved breakthrough. None occupied exploitation positions. All had suffered significant casualties from mines, artillery, and limited tank versus tank engagements. But they were through the minefields, positioned to support continued infantry attacks, and capable of defending against German armor. The partial success would have to suffice. Montgomery's revised plan called for methodical infantry attacks, supported by limited armor advances, systematic destruction of Italian divisions, and grinding attrition that would eventually break Axis resistance. It was not the elegant breakthrough that Doctrine promised, not the mobile warfare that armored commanders preferred, but it was achievable with forces and capabilities available. The battle entered its attritional phase, the crumbling operations that would define the next week of fighting. The gridlock in the minefields became controversial symbol of British operational limitations, subject of post-war debates about command competence, doctrine adequacy, and whether different approaches might have achieved breakthrough more efficiently. Critics argued that Montgomery's plan was flawed from inception, that attempting to push armor through narrow lanes was predictably disastrous, that alternative approaches using infantry and engineer teams to clear wider corridors would have succeeded. Defenders argued that any breakthrough attempt would have encountered similar problems, that mine density made rapid clearance impossible, and that Montgomery's willingness to accept armor casualties to support infantry was correct decision. The debate continues among historians, unresolvable because the counterfactual cannot be tested. What is certain is that the British Army of October 1942 lacked doctrine, training, and equipment necessary for rapid breakthrough of heavily fortified positions. They won at El Alamein not through tactical brilliance but through sustained attritional pressure that eventually overwhelmed Axis capacity to resist. The gridlock proved that material superiority alone was insufficient. Victory required accepting higher casualties than expected, fighting longer than planned, and grinding through defenses with patient determination rather than elegant maneuver. October 26, 1942, dawn. Australian sector, Northern Coastal Region. Lieutenant George Mitchell's company of the Australian 9th Division prepares to assault Thompson's Post, a fortified German position that has resisted 3 previous attacks. The position is approximately 200 yards square, surrounded by wire, protected by minefields, defended by German infantry with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns. Mitchell's orders are simple: take the position, kill or capture defenders, hold against counterattack. Artillery support will be provided, but ammunition is rationed. Barrage will be brief. Tank support is not available. Armor is committed elsewhere. Air support is promised but cannot be guaranteed. Mitchell's company will assault with approximately 120 men against an estimated 40 German defenders who occupy prepared positions and have beaten off every previous attack. The odds seem favorable until Mitchell considers that defenders need kill only 3 attackers each to win, while his soldiers must close 200 yards of open ground under fire, breach wire obstacles, cross minefields, assault prepared positions, and overcome defenders fighting from cover. The company moves forward. 3 hours later, Thompson's Post falls. Mitchell's company suffers 43 casualties. German casualties are 37. The post is captured. The crumbling continues. Operation Lightfoot's transformation from breakthrough attempt to attritional crumbling represented Montgomery's operational adaptability. When armor exploitation failed, when the clean penetration did not materialize, Montgomery shifted strategy without hesitation. The new approach was methodical, systematic, and brutal. Identify Italian positions, mass overwhelming artillery fire, assault with infantry, capture position, repel German counterattack, consolidate, repeat. Each day brought similar operations, attacking different sectors, capturing different objectives, but always following the same pattern. The Italian infantry divisions, already demoralized by artillery bombardment, collapsed quickly once British infantry reached their positions. German units fought harder, defending each position skillfully, counterattacking whenever British consolidated captured ground, inflicting casualties disproportionate to their numbers. But German units were too small, too scattered, too unsupported to prevent the systematic destruction of Axis defensive positions. Each attack reduced Axis combat power incrementally, casualties that could not be replaced, positions that could not be recovered. The Italian Trento Division disintegrated on October 26th, 3,500 men retreating without orders after sustained British artillery bombardment and infantry assault. German commanders reported that entire division was combat ineffective, unable to hold positions, incapable of conducting coordinated defense, essentially useless as military formation. The Brescia Division collapsed October 27th after Australian attacks captured key defensive positions. Bologna Division lasted until October 29th before fragmenting under sustained pressure. The pattern was consistent. Intense artillery bombardment destroyed communications and command structure. British infantry assaulted before defenders recovered. Italian soldiers surrendered in hundreds because fighting seemed pointless against such overwhelming superiority. German commanders watching Italian divisions disintegrate faced operational crisis. Without Italian infantry to hold the line, German divisions must defend sectors far wider than their strength permitted, spreading forces thin, creating vulnerabilities everywhere. Montgomery's revised tactical approach emphasized bite and hold operations, capturing limited objectives with overwhelming fire support, then defending captured ground against inevitable German counterattacks. The concept accepted that breakthrough was impossible in current conditions, that systematic attrition was only achievable strategy. Each attack was carefully planned, rehearsed if time permitted, supported by concentrated artillery fire exceeding anything defenders could survive. British infantry would assault, capture objectives, dig in immediately, call for artillery support against counterattacking Germans, and hold until relieved. The approach was methodical, predictable, effective. German commanders knew exactly what British would do, could predict attack timing and location, but could not prevent attacks from succeeding because they lacked firepower to match British artillery, lacked reserves to replace casualties, and lacked supplies to sustain prolonged defense. Rommel's return to North Africa on October 25th did not change operational reality, but did improve Axis command effectiveness. General Stumme, temporary commander during Rommel's absence, died of heart attack on October 24th during British artillery barrage. Body recovered from British lines hours later. Rommel arrived to find Stumme dead, Italian divisions collapsing, German divisions fighting desperately, and operational situation deteriorating rapidly. His first assessment was coldly accurate. The battle was probably lost. British material superiority was overwhelming. Axis logistics were inadequate, and withdrawal to defensive positions further west was militarily sound. His second assessment was equally accurate. Hitler would never permit withdrawal. Political considerations overrode military reality. Panzer Army Africa must defend until destroyed. Rommel prepared for the defense he knew was ultimately futile, but would conduct professionally anyway, because he was a German officer who followed orders regardless of personal opinions. German counterattacks against British-held positions followed predictable pattern. German infantry would advance with supporting armor. British artillery would engage advancing forces with devastating effect. German attacks would reach British positions depleted and exhausted. Close quarters fighting would ensue. Germans would withdraw, having achieved nothing except mutual casualties. The counterattacks were tactically competent, operationally necessary to prevent British consolidation, and strategically useless because German losses exceeded British, even when counterattacks succeeded temporarily. German commanders recognized the futility but had no alternative. Defending passively meant British captured positions without fighting, which was worse than counterattacking and losing. At least counterattacks inflicted casualties, consumed British ammunition, slowed British operational tempo slightly. The Afrika Korps was dying by degrees, each counterattack reducing its strength permanently, each defensive stand consuming irreplaceable resources. October 28 brought Montgomery's crisis of confidence, the moment when operational success seemed insufficient and political pressure demanded immediate results. Churchill cabled from London, demanding explanation for slow progress, questioning whether offensive would succeed, wondering whether Montgomery was capable of decisive action. Alexander, Middle East commander-in-chief, visited headquarters, listened to Montgomery's explanation that crumbling operations were working exactly as planned, and provided critical political support by reporting to Churchill that Montgomery's methods were sound. Montgomery considered pausing offensive, allowing Eighth Army to rest and reorganize, but recognized that pause would be interpreted as failure. He decided instead to launch one more major assault, Operation Supercharge, concentrated breakthrough attempt in different sector where German defenses might be weaker. The decision demonstrated Montgomery's political awareness as much as military judgment. He needed visible success to maintain Churchill's support, needed dramatic gesture even if methodical crumbling was working. Attrition mathematics through late October revealed the battle's strategic trajectory. British Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 10,000 casualties. October 24th through 30th, concentrated in infantry battalions conducting assault operations, Axis casualties exceeded 35,000. Including 25,000 Italian prisoners from disintegrated divisions. British tank losses totaled perhaps 200 vehicles, but repair workshops and replacement shipments maintained operational strength at approximately 800 tanks. Axis tank strength declined from 489 to 200 operational vehicles, losses exceeding repair capacity and replacement deliveries. British artillery ammunition stocks remained adequate for sustained operations. German and Italian ammunition was critically low. British fuel reserves permitted unrestricted operations. German fuel barely supported minimal defensive movements. Every statistical measure favored Britain overwhelmingly. Yet the battle continued because Axis soldiers fought skillfully, German commanders employed their reduced forces effectively, and Hitler refused to permit withdrawal. Rommel's fuel crisis by late October had become catastrophic. Each counterattack consumed fuel irreplaceable through normal supply channels. Each defensive maneuver, each repositioning of reserves, each movement of supplies forward consumed precious gasoline that could not be replaced. By October 30th, Rommel calculated fuel reserves at 3 days' consumption for defensive operations, 0 days for withdrawal operations. The calculation was militarily decisive. Even if Hitler permitted withdrawal, Panzerarmee Afrika lacked fuel to execute it. They were trapped in positions they could not defend indefinitely, without resources to withdraw to better positions, compelled to fight the battle through to destruction. Rommel signaled Berlin, requesting permission to withdraw to Fuka position, 70 miles west, preserving army for future operations. Hitler's response arrived November 3rd. Victory or death. No retreat permitted. The order sealed Axis defeat at El Alamein and potentially sealed Panzerarmee Afrika's destruction. The crumbling operations through late October proved Montgomery's operational concept, even as they frustrated his timetable. Italian divisions were destroyed, German divisions isolated, Axis defensive capabilities degraded systematically. But the crumbling took longer than Montgomery predicted, cost more casualties than planned, and failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that political leaders demanded. Montgomery recognized that one more major offensive was necessary, fresh breakthrough attempt in sector where German reserves were committed elsewhere, employing lessons learned from Operation Lightfoot's failures. Operation Supercharge would be planned carefully, resourced adequately, and executed with same methodical approach that characterized Montgomery's entire command tenure. The battle was entering its climactic phase, the final push that would break Axis resistance and force the withdrawal that Hitler forbade. Either Supercharge would succeed and Axis army would collapse, or British offensive would stall and operational stalemate would settle over the desert. There was no middle ground, no acceptable compromise. The next 72 hours would determine whether Montgomery's methods worked or whether the Eighth Army faced another desert stalemate. November 3, 1942, 13:30 hours. Panzerarmee Afrika headquarters, behind El Alamein line. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reads the radio message from Berlin for the third time, disbelieving its content, unable to comprehend the operational insanity it represents. Hitler's order is explicit, unambiguous, militarily suicidal. In the situation in which you find yourself, there can be no thought of anything but to hold on, not to yield a step, to throw every weapon and every fighting man who can still be made available into the battle. You can show your troops no other road than that to victory or death. Rommel sets the message down carefully, suppressing the rage he feels, calculating the consequences of Hitler's interference. The operational situation is clear. Axis forces cannot hold current positions against sustained British attacks. Italian divisions have disintegrated. German divisions are at 40% strength. Fuel stocks will be exhausted within 48 hours. The militarily sound decision is immediate withdrawal to Fuka position, 70 miles west, preserving the army for defense of Tunisia. Hitler has forbidden the only rational course of action. Rommel will obey because he is German officer who follows orders, but he knows the order condemns thousands of soldiers to death or captivity when they could be saved through timely withdrawal. The Desert Fox has been caged by his own supreme commander. Rommel's return to Africa on October 25th came too late to affect the battle's outcome, but early enough to witness his army's destruction. He left Egypt in September for medical treatment in Austria, stomach ailments and exhaustion from 2 years of continuous desert warfare, requiring rest that frontline command never permitted. General Georg Stumme commanded in his absence, competent officer but not Rommel, lacking the Desert Fox's operational instinct and legendary status. Stumme's death on October 24th during British artillery barrage deprived Panzerarmee Afrika of command at critical moment. Senior staff officers attempting to coordinate defense while awaiting Rommel's return. When Rommel arrived October 25th, flying from Rome via military aircraft, he received situation reports that confirmed his worst fears. Italian divisions were combat ineffective. German divisions were desperately fighting defensive actions across the entire front. British attacks were systematic and overwhelming, and Axis logistics were in complete collapse. Rommel's immediate assessment on October 25th night was professionally accurate and personally devastating. The battle was probably lost. British material superiority was so overwhelming that German tactical skill could delay but not prevent defeat. Italian divisions could not be relied upon for serious combat operations. German divisions were under strength, exhausted, critically short of fuel and ammunition. Most critically, Axis supply situation made sustained defense impossible. Rommel calculated that his forces could defend for perhaps 1 week before fuel exhaustion, forced immobilization, ammunition depletion ended, ability to resist, and food shortages degraded combat effectiveness. The rational military decision was withdrawal to prepared positions at Fuka or beyond, preserving army for defense of Libya and eventual Tunisia. But Rommel understood political reality as well as military necessity. Hitler's orders repeatedly emphasized that Egypt must be held. That psychological value of holding Suez approaches exceeded operational considerations. That withdrawal would be interpreted as defeat and was therefore forbidden. October 30th, Rommel sent his request to withdraw to Fuka position, carefully worded to emphasize military necessity and preservation of forces for future operations. The message described the operational situation accurately. Italian divisions destroyed, German divisions critically depleted, British attacks increasing in intensity, supply situation catastrophic. Rommel argued that withdrawal to shorter defensive line would allow Panzer Army Africa to defend successfully with available resources, that attempting to hold current positions guaranteed army's destruction, and that losing the army would cost Germany entire North African theater rather than simply losing 100 miles of Egyptian desert. The message was militarily sound, operationally necessary, and politically unacceptable. Hitler read Rommel's assessment and rejected it completely, responding with the victory or death order that forbade any withdrawal under any circumstances. Hitler's reasoning combined political calculation, military ignorance, and ideological rigidity. Politically, German propaganda had celebrated Rommel's advance to El Alamein as proof that Axis victory in Africa was imminent, that Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields would soon fall to German control. Admitting that Rommel must withdraw would require acknowledging that propaganda was false, that strategic situation in Africa favored Britain, and that German forces faced defeat. Hitler refused to make such admission, preferring to sacrifice Panzerarmee Afrika rather than admit error publicly. Militarily, Hitler believed that German soldiers' superior will and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that determination to hold ground mattered more than logistics or force ratios. He could not comprehend that courage was insufficient when tanks lacked fuel, guns lacked ammunition, and soldiers lacked food. Ideologically, Hitler's worldview permitted no retreat, no acknowledgement of defeat, no rational calculation of military necessity versus political cost. The 24-hour delay between Rommel's request and Hitler's response proved operationally decisive. From October 30th through November 3rd, Rommel maintained defensive positions, conserving fuel for potential withdrawal, avoiding major counterattacks that would consume irreplaceable resources. If Hitler had authorized withdrawal immediately, Rommel could have begun retrograde operations November 1st, potentially saving substantial portion of his army. Operation Supercharge, British breakthrough attempt launched November 2nd, would have struck positions already evacuated, achieving breakthrough against minimal resistance but capturing few prisoners. Hitler's delay meant that Rommel's forces remained in positions when Supercharge struck, that the breakthrough occurred against forces still holding the line, and that subsequent withdrawal occurred under maximum British pressure. The delay transformed potential orderly withdrawal into chaotic rout. Italian divisions' complete collapse by early November left German units defending sectors far exceeding their capabilities. The Ariete Armored Division, elite Italian formation equipped with modern tanks, was annihilated November 3rd, covering German withdrawal. 5,000 men, an entire tank complement destroyed in rearguard action. The Littorio Division disintegrated without fighting, soldiers deserting in thousands. The Trieste Division attempted to withdraw on foot after vehicles were destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel, marched eastward into British lines, and surrendered en masse. German commanders watching Italian disintegration knew their own forces would soon face similar fate. Without Italian infantry to hold defensive sectors, German divisions must spread across the entire front, creating gaps everywhere, making coordinated defense impossible. The Panzer Army Afrika was dissolving before Rommel's eyes. Rommel's decision to begin withdrawal November 3rd evening, despite Hitler's orders forbidding retreat, represented career-ending insubordination by normal military standards. German officers did not disobey direct orders from Supreme Commander, especially when those orders were explicit and unambiguous. Rommel chose to disobey because the alternative was watching his entire army destroyed for no operational gain, condemning 50,000 German soldiers to death or captivity when they could be saved. He rationalized the decision by claiming operational circumstances had changed since Hitler's order, that withdrawal was tactical adjustment rather than strategic retreat, that preserving forces for defense of Libya served Hitler's broader strategic objectives better than sacrificing them at El Alamein. The rationalization was thin sophistry. Rommel was disobeying orders, accepting potential court-martial, because he valued his soldiers' lives above his own career. The decision was ethically complex. Rommel was serving Nazi regime, fighting war of aggression, but at that moment was trying to save men from pointless death. History judges Rommel harshly for his association with Nazism, but the November 3rd decision revealed capacity for independent moral judgment that some German generals lacked. Hitler's response to Rommel's unauthorized withdrawal was fury, followed by impotent acceptance. By the time Hitler learned that Rommel had disobeyed victory or death orders, the withdrawal was irreversible. German forces were retreating rapidly westward, and attempting to enforce original orders would require relieving Rommel, appointing new commander, and ordering forces to return to positions they had already abandoned. Hitler settled for reprimanding Rommel privately, allowing the withdrawal to continue, and saving face by claiming that withdrawal was always planned tactical adjustment rather than admission of defeat. The entire episode demonstrated dysfunction in German command structure, where political leaders issued operationally impossible orders, field commanders disobeyed when reality contradicted orders, and everyone pretended that orders had been followed while actually ignoring them. The victory or death order's impact extended beyond immediate operational consequences. It confirmed to German field commanders that Hitler understood nothing about operational warfare, that strategic decisions were driven by propaganda considerations rather than military reality, and that following orders literally would result in unnecessary German casualties. Subsequent operations in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and eventually Germany itself featured similar patterns. Hitler ordering positions held to last man, field commanders recognizing impossibility, commanders choosing between obeying orders and preserving forces. Some commanders obeyed and watched their units destroyed. Others disobeyed and saved their soldiers at cost of careers. The El Alamein order established precedent that would be repeated throughout the war's remaining years. Dysfunctional command relationship between political leadership and military commanders that contributed significantly to Germany's ultimate defeat. November 4th morning, Rommel's forces began full-scale withdrawal, abandoning El Alamein positions, streaming westward on coastal road, harassed by RAF fighter bombers, pursued by British armor. The victory or death order had delayed withdrawal by 72 critical hours, hours that allowed British to position forces for pursuit, that consumed German fuel reserves needed for organized withdrawal, and that transformed potential fighting withdrawal into desperate retreat. Hitler's interference turned tactical defeat into operational disaster, ensured that Panzer Army Afrika would not reach Tunisia intact, and demonstrated that Nazi Germany's strategic decision-making was fundamentally flawed. The Desert Fox escaped the cage, but his army was shattered in the process, never to recover the strength or confidence that had characterized its earlier victories. November 2nd, 1942, 0 to 100 hours. Tel El Akakir sector, 5 miles south of Coastal Highway. Brigadier John Curry receives his orders for commanding the 9th Armored Brigade in tomorrow's attack and reads them twice to ensure he understands their implications. The brigade, consisting of 94 tanks, will assault German anti-tank gun positions at dawn, advancing across 4,000 yards of open ground against the most lethal anti-tank defenses in the German arsenal. The objective is not to destroy the guns, but to reveal their positions by absorbing their fire, allowing following British artillery to suppress them, creating gap for 1st Armored Division's exploitation. Montgomery's staff officer delivering the orders is explicit. The success of the operation depends on your brigade accepting approximately 50% casualties. Curry understands. His brigade is being sacrificed, deliberately sent forward to die so that others can exploit the breakthrough those deaths create. He does not protest. He does not question. He ensures his regimental commanders understand the mission, tells them honestly what casualties to expect, and prepares his brigade for the assault that will determine the battle's outcome. Operation Supercharge represented Montgomery's final offensive effort, fresh breakthrough attempt incorporating lessons learned from Operation Lightfoot's failures. The attack would strike in different sector, Tel El Akakir, 5 miles inland from the coast where German reserves had not been concentrated. Second, New Zealand Division's infantry would attack overnight, creating gap in Axis lines through systematic application of overwhelming artillery fire. 9th Armored Brigade would charge at dawn, engaging German anti-tank guns at close range, accepting catastrophic casualties to reveal gun positions. 1st Armored Division would then exploit through the gap, advancing into operational depth behind German lines, threatening Rommel's supply routes and forcing General Axis withdrawal. The plan was methodical, ruthless in its acceptance of casualties, and designed to succeed through weight of resources rather than tactical cleverness. November 2nd, 0 to 1, 0 to 5 hours. 2nd New Zealand Division begins its assault, infantry advancing under creeping artillery barrage, methodically clearing German and Italian defensive positions. The New Zealanders had learned from Operation Lightfoot's coordination failures, practicing combined arms operations until infantry-artillery coordination was instinctive. Companies advanced exactly 100 yards behind the barrage, trusting that shells would suppress defenders, maintaining formation even when casualties occurred. By 0 to 400 hours, New Zealand infantry had cleared objectives, established bridgehead 4,000 yards deep, and signaled that gap was ready for armored exploitation. German defenders were disorganized, command structure disrupted, communications severed. The conditions for breakthrough were optimal, better than anything achieved during Operation Lightfoot. Now came the test. Could British armor exploit successfully? 05:45 hours. 9th Armored Brigade begins its charge. 94 tanks advance line abreast, maintaining formation, closing steadily on German anti-tank gun positions that New Zealand infantry had identified but could not suppress. German gunners wait with professional discipline, knowing that firing too early alerts British artillery to their positions. That waiting until British tanks reach close range guarantees kills, but also guarantees counter-battery fire will destroy them immediately afterward. 600 yards. German guns remain silent. 500 yards. Still silent. 400 yards. The German line erupts. 88mm guns firing from prepared positions. 75mm anti-tank guns engaging from secondary positions. Machine guns suppressing British tank commanders who expose themselves attempting to observe. British tanks begin exploding. Turrets blown off by 88mm armor-piercing shot. Holes burning from ammunition fires. Crews bailing out under machine gun fire. Curry's tank is hit, immobilized. He transfers to another vehicle and continues forward. The charge does not stop. The sacrifice of the 9th Armored Brigade was extraordinary and terrible. 75 of 94 tanks were destroyed in 30 minutes of fighting. Tank crews dying at their positions, survivors attempting to return fire while their vehicles burned around them. The casualty rate exceeded 50%, as Montgomery's staff officer predicted, actually reaching nearly 80% in tank losses and 58% in crew casualties. 230 of 400 crew members were killed or wounded. Men who had trained together for months, fought together through the desert campaign, died together in 30 minutes of concentrated violence. But their sacrifice achieved its objective. German anti-tank guns revealed their positions by firing. British artillery observers called down devastating fire. German gun crews died at their weapons or retreated abandoning equipment. By 0 to 6:30 hours, the anti-tank gun line was suppressed, shattered, combat ineffective. The gap that 9th Armored Brigade died to create was open. 0900 hours, 1st Armored Division advances through the gap. 140 tanks passing through the wreckage of 9th Armored Brigade's assault. German resistance is scattered, uncoordinated, insufficient to stop the exploitation. British tanks advance 6 miles by midday, reaching positions behind German defensive line, threatening supply routes, creating the operational crisis that Rommel feared. 21st Panzer Division attempts counterattack, engaging 1st Armored Division in mobile tank battle, the kind of engagement where German tactical skill traditionally dominated. But German tanks are outnumbered 3-1, crews are exhausted, ammunition is limited, and fuel reserves permit only limited maneuvers. The counterattack is beaten off with heavy German losses. By evening, 1st Armored Division holds ground deep in German rear areas. The breakthrough has been achieved, and Rommel signals Berlin that withdrawal is essential to prevent complete destruction. The tactical innovations in Supercharge addressed Operation Lightfoot's failures systematically. The attack struck at single concentrated point, rather than dispersed across entire corps frontage, massing overwhelming combat power against narrow sector. Mine clearance was more thorough, engineers given additional time and resources to clear lanes properly. Artillery support was concentrated, every available gun massed to support the breakthrough attempt. Armor advance was timed carefully, 9th Armored Brigade attacking at dawn when light conditions favored attackers. 1st Armored Division exploiting immediately afterward rather than hours later, as in Lightfoot. The coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers approached the integration that British combined arms doctrine promised but rarely achieved. Supercharge succeeded where Lightfoot failed because Montgomery's staff learned from previous mistakes and refused to repeat them. German defensive crisis by November, second evening, was existential. Italian divisions had essentially ceased to exist as combat formations. German divisions were reduced to fractions of authorized strength. The anti-tank gun screen that was supposed to protect German defensive positions had been shattered. British armor was operating in German rear areas for the first time in the campaign. Fuel stocks were critically low, insufficient for major redeployment or sustained mobile operations. Ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted, artillery reduced to rationed fire that could not stop British advances. Rommel's assessment to Berlin was accurate. The battle is lost. The army faces annihilation if retreat is not immediate. Only question was whether Hitler would authorize withdrawal in time to save anything from the wreckage. November 3rd, 1st Armored Division expands its penetration, engaging German reserves that attempt to contain the breakthrough. Tank battles rage across the desert, 1st Armored Division gradually overwhelming German resistance through numerical superiority rather than tactical skill. Losses are roughly equal in proportional terms, but proportional losses favor the British overwhelmingly when they begin with 300 tank advantage. By evening, Afrika Korps is reduced to 90 operational tanks, barely sufficient to cover withdrawal, entirely inadequate for sustained defensive operations. The Italian Ariete Armored Division makes its last stand, attempting to hold positions south of the breakthrough to allow German withdrawal. Ariete's radio message becomes famous. Enemy tanks attacking from all sides, tanks of Ariete surrounded, position hopeless. Ariete continues to fight. By afternoon, Ariete Division has been destroyed, 5,000 men killed or captured, entire tank complement destroyed, the division effectively ceasing to exist. Operation Supercharge's success confirmed Montgomery's operational approach: methodical planning, overwhelming resources, acceptance of high casualties in assault forces, systematic exploitation once breakthrough achieved. The approach was not innovative or brilliant in traditional military sense, but it worked, and working mattered more than elegance. British casualties in Supercharge totaled approximately 4,000, including the 9th Armored Brigade's sacrifice, heavy but acceptable given the strategic results. Axis casualties exceeded 15,000, including 10,000 prisoners, losses that Rommel could not replace. The operational balance shifted decisively. British forces had broken through prepared German defenses, achieved the exploitation that eluded them in Operation Lightfoot, and created conditions for pursuit that could potentially destroy Rommel's army completely. The question was whether British pursuit would be aggressive enough to prevent German withdrawal, to trap and destroy Panzer Army Africa before it escaped to Libya. That question would be answered in the coming days as British armor raced westward and German forces retreated in growing desperation. November 4th, 1942, dawn. Fouca, Egypt, 60 miles west of El Alamein. Lieutenant Colonel Pip Roberts leads the reconnaissance elements of 11th Hussars into the abandoned German supply base at Fouca, expecting resistance, finding only chaos. Fuel dumps burn, destroyed by withdrawing Germans to deny them to pursuers. Supply trucks stand abandoned, out of fuel, useless to owners who lack gasoline to operate them. Wounded German and Italian soldiers wait for capture, too injured to join the retreat, left behind by commanders who had no transport to evacuate them. Documents litter the ground, hastily abandoned by staff officers who fled hours earlier. Roberts orders his units to secure the base, call forward infantry to process prisoners, and continue pursuit westward. Somewhere ahead, perhaps 20 miles, perhaps 50, Rommel's surviving forces retreat in column on the coastal highway, harassed by RAF fighter bombers, desperately seeking to reach Libya before British armor intercepts them. The pursuit has begun, the race that will determine whether Rommel's army escapes intact or dies in the desert. Roberts knows that every hour of delay allows more Germans to escape, that aggressive pursuit could end the North African campaign immediately. But he also knows that his light armored cars cannot stop German panzer divisions, that he must wait for heavy armor to arrive before pressing pursuit aggressively. The pursuit phase revealed persistent British operational limitations despite overwhelming material advantages. 1st Armored Division reached Fouca November 4th afternoon, finding the base abandoned, as Roberts reported, clear evidence that German retreat was accelerating. Division commander ordered immediate pursuit westward, seeking to intercept retreating German columns before they reached Libya. But fuel shortages slowed British advance. Supply trucks could not keep pace with advancing armor. Units halted repeatedly, waiting for fuel bowsers to arrive. The same logistics problem that crippled Rommel now affected British pursuit, inability to maintain supply to rapidly advancing mobile forces. German forces, retreating on single coastal road with shorter supply lines from their forward units to rear areas, maintained better logistical continuity than pursuing British despite overall resource disadvantage. November 5th through 6th, weather intervened decisively. Rain began falling over the western desert, unusual for November but not unprecedented, transforming sand into mud within hours. Wheeled vehicles bogged down immediately. Only tracked vehicles could maintain mobility, but even tanks moved slowly through soupy terrain. British advance halted almost completely, while German columns continued retreating on the coastal highway, paved surface remaining passable, while off-road terrain became impassable. The rain lasted 36 hours, long enough to allow German retreat columns to open significant gap between themselves and pursuers. When ground dried and pursuit resumed, German forces had gained 3-day lead, sufficient to reach prepared defensive positions at Sollum, and begin organizing rearguard actions that would delay British pursuit further. RAF, Desert Air Force, flew over 1,200 sorties during the pursuit phase, attacking German columns with bombs, cannon fire, and delayed action munitions dropped on the coastal highway. The attacks destroyed hundreds of vehicles, killed thousands of soldiers, created chaos in German retreat. But the Luftwaffe's rearguard operations prevented complete interdiction. German fighters, though outnumbered 3-1, challenged RAF attacks with desperate courage, creating enough disruption to prevent systematic destruction of retreat columns. German anti-aircraft units, positioned at regular intervals along retreat route, forced RAF bombers to higher altitudes where accuracy decreased significantly. The air campaign inflicted severe casualties but could not stop the retreat, could not prevent substantial German forces from reaching Libya and preparing for continued resistance. British pursuit strategy became controversial immediately and remains debated by historians. Montgomery chose methodical pursuit, maintaining logistics, refusing risky deep penetration attempts that might trap pursuing forces without supply. His critics, then and now, argue that aggressive pursuit accepting fuel shortages and supply risks could have destroyed Rommel's army completely. That caution allowed Germans to escape when they should have been annihilated. Montgomery's defenders argue that previous British pursuit attempts had failed catastrophically, that German rearguards were skilled at counterattacking overextended British forces, And that methodical approach ensured steady advance without the reversals that plagued earlier operations. The debate is unresolvable because counterfactual cannot be tested. What is certain is that substantial German forces escaped from El Alamein. Approximately 30,000 German troops reached Tunisia and fought Allied forces for another 6 months, when more aggressive pursuit might have trapped them in Libya. November 8th, British forces reached Alamein Mattered, 250 miles advanced in 4 days, averaging over 60 miles per day, but with operational pauses that allowed German forces to maintain lead. Mattered had been British supply base until Rommel's advance in June, now reoccupied by British forces pursuing westward. Supply dumps were re-established, casualties evacuated, units rested before continuing pursuit. The operational pause was necessary from logistics perspective, but allowed German forces additional time to escape. By November 13th, Rommel's surviving forces reached Tobruk, finding the fortress city already abandoned by Italian garrison, unable to defend because British siege had eliminated most defensive fortifications. The Germans continued westward, not stopping until reaching Tunisia, where they would link with fresh German forces that were being flown in to establish new defensive line. Prisoner totals from the pursuit phase confirmed that Italian forces had essentially ceased to exist as organized military formation. Approximately 30,000 Axis prisoners were captured November 4th through 15th. 25,000 of them Italian infantry from divisions that disintegrated during the retreat. Italian soldiers marched into captivity in long columns, many seeming relieved that their war was over, resentful toward German allies, who had commandeered Italian transport for their own retreat while leaving Italians to walk. German prisoners were fewer, perhaps 5,000 during pursuit phase, mostly wounded who could not keep pace with retreating columns or stragglers whose vehicles broke down. The Afrika Korps mechanized units maintained cohesion throughout retreat, fighting successful rearguard actions at Halfaya Pass and Sollum that prevented British from intercepting main body of retreating forces. Equipment losses during pursuit exceeded combat losses from the battle itself. German forces abandoned approximately 450 tanks destroyed or immobilized, 1,000 artillery pieces left behind when prime movers lacked fuel to tow them, countless vehicles burned by retreating troops to prevent capture. British and Commonwealth forces captured mountain of supplies, German engineering equipment, Italian ammunition stocks, medical supplies, quartermaster stores, everything that could not be loaded on scarce operational vehicles. The captured equipment revealed the material disparity between forces. British tanks were generally newer, better maintained, more capable than German counterparts at equivalent point in their service lives. German tanks showed evidence of field repairs, jury-rigged mechanical fixes, desperate improvisation to keep vehicles operational despite lack of spare parts. The material culture of the two armies differed fundamentally. Alternative pursuit strategies debated after the war included long-range armored penetration directly to Benghazi, cutting Rommel's retreat route, aggressive exploitation through southern desert to intercept coastal highway further west, and amphib-IS landing at Tobruk, timed to coincide with overland pursuit. Each alternative carried significant risks. Deep penetration forces might have outrun supply lines and been destroyed by German counterattacks. Southern desert routes lacked water and were inadequately mapped. Amphibious operations required landing craft and air superiority not available in November. Montgomery's methodical pursuit was least risky option, guaranteed continued advance without catastrophic reversals, but also guaranteed that significant German forces would escape to fight another day. November 15th, Rommel's surviving forces crossed from Libya into Tunisia, approximately 30,000 German troops and 15,000 Italian troops from original force of 104,000. The remainder were dead, wounded, or captured, Panzerarmee Africa reduced to fraction of its pre-battle strength. But the survivors were Afrika Korps veterans, experienced soldiers who knew how to fight in North African conditions, commanded by officers who had learned their trade in desert warfare's harsh school. These survivors would form core of Axis resistance in Tunisia, fighting tenaciously through spring 1943 before final surrender in May. Montgomery's pursuit had inflicted severe losses, captured vast quantities of equipment, and driven Axis forces completely from Egypt and Libya. But it had not destroyed Rommel's army completely, had not ended North African campaign immediately, as some optimists hoped. The war in Africa would continue 6 more months, require additional British and American lives, and consume resources that might have been employed elsewhere. The pursuit was successful by any reasonable measure, but fell short of complete victory that perfect execution might have achieved. November 4th, 1942, mid-afternoon, Ariete Armored Division Headquarters, south of Coastal Highway. Colonel Francesco Arena watches British tanks approaching from 3 directions, encircling his division's positions, cutting off every escape route. His radio operator receives the final message from Division Command. Tanks of Ariete surrounded, position hopeless, enemy tanks attacking from all sides. Ariete continues to fight. Arena knows what the message means. The division has been ordered to hold its ground, to delay British pursuit, to sacrifice itself so that German forces can retreat westward unhindered. His soldiers are Italian, his tanks are Italian. His orders come from German commanders, who commandeered every available truck for German retreat while leaving Italian infantry to walk into captivity. The Ariete division has fought well throughout the campaign, earning respect even from German officers who usually dismissed Italian military capabilities. Now they will fight their last battle, not for victory but for time, not for Italy but for German allies who treated them with barely concealed contempt. Arena orders his remaining tanks forward. They advance toward overwhelming British forces, guns firing, knowing they cannot win, fighting anyway because Italian soldiers deserve to end their war with honor, even if their German allies denied them that honor during 2 years of desert warfare. Italy's military catastrophe at El Alamein extended beyond simple battlefield casualties to represent the effective end of Italy as serious military power in the Mediterranean theater. 8 Italian divisions committed to El Alamain's defense: Trento, Brescia, Bologna, Pavia, Trieste, Folgore, Parachute, Littorio Armored, and Ariete Armored. By November 5th, all 8 divisions had ceased to exist as combat-effective formations. Approximately 54,000 Italian troops fought at El Alamein. Final casualty figures exceeded 40,000. 1,100 killed, 1,500 wounded, 20,000 captured during the battle itself, and an additional 15,000 captured during the retreat. Equipment losses totaled approximately 500 tanks destroyed or captured, 800 artillery pieces abandoned, countless trucks and support vehicles destroyed. The material losses were catastrophic, but replaceable given time and industrial capacity. The psychological damage was permanent. The pattern of Italian division collapse was remarkably consistent. First came sustained British artillery bombardment, weight of fire exceeding anything Italian forces had experienced or trained for, destroying communications, killing commanders, isolating units from higher headquarters. Then came British infantry assault, advancing while Italian defenders were still disorganized from bombardment, overwhelming positions before defense could be organized. Italian soldiers fought initially, some units resisted fiercely, but sustained resistance required supply, reinforcement, and hope of success. When none appeared, when German forces withdrew to protect their own positions, when Italian requests for support were ignored or denied, resistance collapsed. Soldiers surrendered in hundreds, then thousands, some after fierce fighting that exhausted ammunition, others after token resistance that satisfied honor requirements without requiring suicidal defense of indefensible positions. The Folgore Parachute Division represented Italian forces at their best and suffered accordingly. Elite paratroopers, well-trained and properly equipped by Italian standards, the Folgore held positions at Deir el-Munasib in the southern sector throughout Operation Lightfoot. British attacks in their sector achieved limited success. Folgore paratroopers fighting with skill and determination, counterattacking effectively, maintaining cohesion under sustained pressure, but elite status could not overcome fundamental resource disparity. British artillery outweighed Folgore's by ratios of 10-1. British air support dominated the skies. British logistics ensured continuous supply while Folgore's supplies dwindled. By November 4th, the Folgore division had exhausted ammunition, lost contact with higher headquarters, and faced British forces that outnumbered them 5-1. Division commander ordered surrender after ensuring that all weapons were destroyed, that soldiers had fought until resistance became impossible, that honor was satisfied. The Folgore marched into captivity with heads held high, having earned respect from British captors through their skilled defense. German-Italian command relationships during the battle revealed deep dysfunction within Axis alliance. German commanders consistently blamed Italian units for failures, while assigning them the most difficult positions with worst equipment. Italian divisions received older tanks, inadequate anti-tank guns, insufficient artillery support, and were positioned in sectors where German commanders expected British attacks. When Italian units collapsed under overwhelming British pressure, German reports blamed Italian cowardice and incompetence, rather than acknowledging the impossible positions and inadequate support that guaranteed Italian failure. Rommel's post-battle reports followed this pattern, attributing Axis defeat primarily to Italian collapse, minimizing German responsibility, protecting his own reputation at Italian expense. The pattern was professionally dishonest and politically convenient, allowing Rommel to explain defeat, without admitting that German forces were also overwhelmed by British material superiority. Italian equipment inferiority contributed significantly to collapse. Italian tanks were obsolete by 1942 standards, mounting guns inadequate against British armor, protected by thin armor vulnerable to British anti-tank weapons, mechanically unreliable in desert conditions. The M13 tank, Italy's standard medium tank, mounted a 47mm gun that could not penetrate British Grant or Sherman tanks at combat ranges, while British 75mm guns destroyed M13s easily at 2,000 yards. Italian anti-tank guns were similarly inadequate, 47mm weapons requiring close range to be effective against British armor, exposing Italian gun crews to British fire while unable to return effective fire. Italian soldiers fought with courage and determination, but could not overcome equipment that was simply insufficient for the operational demands of desert warfare against a technologically superior opponent. The Italian soldiers' experience at El Alamein differed fundamentally from the German experience. German soldiers fought knowing that their equipment was competitive, that their training was excellent, that their commanders were skilled, and that defeat resulted from material disparity rather than personal inadequacy. Italian soldiers fought knowing that their equipment was inferior, that their training was inadequate, that their commanders were dismissed by German allies, and that they were expected to fail. This psychological burden affected combat performance in ways difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Some Italian units fought magnificently despite these disadvantages, proving that Italian soldiers could match any army when properly led and equipped. Most units fought adequately until circumstances made continued resistance pointless, then surrendered without shame, because they had done what was possible with resources available. A few units collapsed immediately, but even these failures reflected leadership and morale problems that were symptoms of deeper systemic dysfunction rather than causes. November 5th through 10th, as British forces pursued retreating, Axis forces westward, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers walked eastward into captivity. They had no vehicles, no fuel, no supplies, and no hope of reaching Libya before British forces intercepted them. Some walked in organized columns under officer command, maintaining military discipline in defeat. Others scattered across the desert in small groups, seeking water and British forces simultaneously, because capture meant food, water, and medical treatment that they could not provide themselves. British prisoner of war cages rapidly filled beyond capacity, guards overwhelmed by thousands of Italian prisoners arriving daily. Many Italian prisoners were grateful that their war was over, that they had survived, that they would spend remaining war years in relative safety and comfort of prison camps rather than dying in desert warfare. The sentiment was not universal, but was common enough that British interrogators noted it repeatedly in reports. German commanders' treatment of Italian allies during the retreat exemplified the broader dysfunction in Axis alliance. German forces commandeered Italian vehicles for German retreat, leaving Italian infantry without transport. German supply convoys refused to carry Italian wounded, reserving space for German casualties. German rearguards positioned themselves to protect German units, while Italian units were left exposed to British pursuit. The pattern was coldly rational from German perspective. German forces were more combat effective than Italian. Preserving German strength maintained greater overall combat power than preserving Italian strength. Therefore, Italian units were expendable while German units must be saved. But the pattern also destroyed any remaining Italian loyalty to German alliance, confirmed Italian soldiers' suspicions that they were considered expendable by their allies, and ensured that when Italy sought armistice in 1943, Italian soldiers felt little compunction about changing sides. Italian casualties at El Alamein influenced Italy's subsequent military performance and eventual political collapse. The loss of 8 divisions, approximately 40,000 casualties, and vast quantities of equipment devastated Italian military capacity in the Mediterranean. Italy could not replace the losses quickly. Italian industrial capacity was inadequate, trained replacements were unavailable, equipment production could not keep pace with losses. More significantly, El Alamain's losses convinced many Italian leaders that the war was unwinnable, that continued alliance with Germany guaranteed eventual defeat, and that Italy should seek separate peace before Allied invasion of Italian territory. The path from El Alamein to Italian armistice in September 1943 was not direct or inevitable, but El Alamein demonstrated conclusively that Italy lacked resources to sustain total war against Allied coalition. The defeat planted seeds that would ultimately destroy Mussolini's regime and Italian participation in Axis alliance. The Ariete Division's destruction on November 3rd and 4th encapsulated Italian military tragedy at El Alamein. An elite unit, well-trained and properly equipped by Italian standards, the Ariete fought skillfully throughout the campaign. At Bir Hacheim and Gazala, the division performed effectively. At El Alamein, it was assigned rearguard mission during German retreat, ordered to hold positions while German forces withdrew, sacrificed deliberately to buy time for German escape. The division fought its last battle with courage and professionalism, engaging British armor in hopeless circumstances, maintaining cohesion while being systematically destroyed. By evening November 4th, the Ariete Division had ceased to exist. 5,000 men dead or captured, all tanks destroyed, the division's name stricken from Italian order of battle. Italian historians remember Ariete as symbol of Italian courage, squandered by German allies, who valued Italian lives less than German lives. Accurate assessment that helps explain Italy's eventual betrayal of German alliance. The lost divisions at El Alamein represented not just military defeat, but the death of Italian military ambition and the beginning of Italian disillusionment with fascism's promises of martial glory. November 10th, 1942. British Military Cemetery, El Alamein. Private James Henderson stands beside the fresh grave of his best friend, killed October 24th during the Highland Division's assault through German minefields. The cemetery is expanding daily, burial parties working continuously to inter British and Commonwealth dead, markers being placed temporarily until proper headstones can be manufactured and shipped from Britain. Henderson survived the battle physically unscathed, but carries invisible wounds, memories of men dying beside him, images of bodies shattered by shells, sounds of wounded screaming in darkness. He writes letter to his friend's mother in Scotland, struggling to explain how her son died, what he died for, whether his death mattered. Henderson writes that her son died heroically, capturing German positions, saving comrades' lives, contributing to great victory. The letter is kind lie. His friend died stepping on mine while advancing through cleared lane, killed instantly by explosion, died before contributing anything to battle's outcome except becoming casualty statistic. But Henderson cannot tell mother that truth, cannot explain that modern warfare kills randomly and impersonally, that individual courage matters less than artillery concentrations and supply tonnages. He writes the kind lie because families need to believe that deaths had meaning, even when soldiers know that meaning is constructed afterward to make sacrifice bearable. British and Commonwealth casualty statistics from El Alamein totaled 13,560 casualties, including 2,350 killed, 8,950 wounded, and 2,260 missing. The numbers were concentrated in infantry battalions that conducted assault operations, some battalions suffering 50 to 60% casualties, entire companies reduced to remnants. The Highland Division, Australian Division, New Zealand Division, all suffered grievously. Armor casualties were lighter in personnel terms, though heavier in equipment, tank losses exceeding 500 vehicles destroyed or damaged, though many were recovered and repaired. The casualties were sustainable from British Empire's perspective, painful but acceptable given the strategic results achieved. But for families who received telegrams reporting death or wounding, for units that lost half their strength, for survivors who carried psychological scars, the casualties were devastating regardless of strategic justification. Churchill's political transformation following El Alamein justified Montgomery's methods from British government's perspective. The Prime Minister faced vote of no confidence in July, narrowly survived through parliamentary maneuvering, remained politically vulnerable throughout summer and fall. El Alamein's victory provided political capital that Churchill desperately needed, proof that British forces could defeat German armies, evidence that Mediterranean strategy was working, justification for Churchill's conduct of war. On November 10th, Churchill gave his famous speech at Lord Mayor's banquet. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. The phrase captured British mood perfectly, acknowledging that victory was distant, but recognizing that the long string of defeats had finally ended. Churchill's political position solidified, vote of no confidence threats disappeared, and Prime Minister gained breathing room to plan 1943 operations without constant parliamentary challenges to his authority. Tank crew casualty statistics revealed the brutal reality of armored warfare. British tank crews in breakthrough operations faced approximately 3-day average life expectancy before their vehicle was destroyed or disabled. Crew survival rates when tanks were destroyed varied by hit location and ammunition fire. Turret penetrations often killed all crew instantly. Hull penetrations sometimes allowed crew escape. Ammunition explosions killed everyone with near certainty. The 9th Armored Brigade's sacrifice during Operation Supercharge illustrated these statistics terribly. 75 tanks destroyed in 30 minutes, 230 of 400 crew members killed or wounded, survivors often suffering severe burns or trauma injuries. Tank crews accepted these risks because mission required it, because their friends were in other tanks, because refusing meant courts-martial, and because soldiers in combat operate on immediate concerns of survival and mission, rather than statistical analysis of long-term survival prospects. Montgomery's reputation emerged from El Alamein enormously enhanced, elevated from competent trainer to national hero, from controversial general to Britain's most famous military commander. The reputation was built partly on genuine achievement, partly on careful publicity management, and partly on Britain's desperate need for military heroes after 3 years of defeat. Montgomery understood publicity's importance, cultivated journalists, allowed himself to be photographed extensively, and crafted public persona as confident, unconventional commander who ensured British soldiers would never again be sacrificed through incompetent planning. The persona was partially accurate, partially constructed, but politically effective. British public embraced Montgomery as symbol of turning tide, proof that British forces could defeat Germans, an embodiment of meticulous professionalism that contrasted favorably with romantic but failed commanders of earlier campaigns. Cost-effectiveness analysis of El Alamein's casualties, compared to strategic results, justified Montgomery's methodical approach from military perspective. British could afford 13,500 casualties to destroy Axis army of 100,000, capture 60,000 prisoners, eliminate Italian military presence in North Africa, and drive German forces from Egypt and Libya. Previous British offensives had achieved less at similar or higher cost. Operation Battleaxe in June 1941 gained nothing at cost of nearly 1,000 casualties. Operation Crusader in November 1941 won tactical victory at cost of 18,000 casualties, but failed to destroy Rommel's forces permanently. El Alamein's casualties purchased decisive strategic results rather than temporary tactical advantages, making battle cost-effective despite high absolute casualty numbers. But cost-effectiveness analysis provides cold comfort to soldiers who lost friends, families who lost sons, and society that mourned thousands of young men dead in Egyptian desert. Equipment losses comparison between British and Axis forces revealed the battle's true nature as industrial conflict rather than tactical contest. British lost 500 tanks during battle, but maintained operational strength at 700 tanks through repairs and replacements, ending battle with more operational tanks than at start. Axis forces lost 450 tanks and could replace almost none, ending battle with 90 operational tanks versus 489 at start. British artillery fired 1 million shells and resupplied completely within 2 weeks. Axis artillery fired perhaps 200,000 shells and could not resupply at all. British air forces lost approximately 100 aircraft and replaced them within days. Luftwaffe lost similar numbers and could not replace them for weeks or months. The attrition was sustainable for Britain, catastrophic for Axis, demonstrating that El Alamein was won primarily through overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. Strategic consequences extended far beyond immediate military results. Operation Torch. Allied landings in Algeria and Morocco on November 8th guaranteed Axis defeat in North Africa by creating two-front situation that Axis could not sustain. El Alamein ensured that Rommel could not counterattack eastward, that Axis forces were too weak to threaten Egypt even if Torch failed, and that British position in Middle East was secure regardless of subsequent operations. The two operations, El Alamein and Torch, effectively ended Axis presence in North Africa, though 6 months of fighting remained. More broadly, El Alamein and concurrent Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked November 1942 as the war's strategic turning point, moment when Axis expansion ceased and Allied counteroffensive began. Whether El Alamein or Stalingrad was more strategically significant remains debated, but both battles demonstrated that Axis powers could be defeated through sustained pressure and material superiority. November 1954, El Alamein Cemetery Dedication Ceremony. British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian dignitaries gather to dedicate permanent cemetery for Commonwealth war dead. 7,367 graves, each marked with identical white headstone, arranged in neat rows across the desert where they died. Families make pilgrimage from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, seeking graves of sons and brothers and husbands who died 12 years earlier. The cemetery is beautifully maintained, peaceful, wholly inadequate to communicate the violence and chaos that created it. Tour guides explain battle's course, show positions where various units fought, describe tactical maneuvers that led to victory. Visitors struggle to reconcile peaceful present with violent past, cannot imagine the sounds, smells, fear, and confusion that characterized combat. The cemetery memorializes sacrifice without communicating experience, remembers dead without explaining what they endured before dying. Veterans who return stand quietly beside graves of friends, remembering not the glory of victory but the terrible cost of achieving it. Post-war accounting of battle's cost extended beyond immediate casualties, to include long-term psychological damage, physical disabilities, and familial disruption. Thousands of El Alamein veterans suffered what contemporaries called battle fatigue, and later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, psychological injuries as real and debilitating as physical wounds. Thousands more carried physical disabilities, lost limbs, blindness, chronic pain from injuries that never healed properly. Families dealt with returned soldiers who were changed, damaged, unable to resume pre-war lives, struggling with memories they could not share and pain they could not explain. The battle's cost cannot be measured solely in casualty statistics. Full accounting requires considering decades of suffering by survivors and their families, consequences that extended far beyond November 1942. Victory at El Alamein was achieved at terrible price that was worth paying from strategic perspective, but remained terrible nonetheless from human perspective. Montgomery's tactical approach at El Alamein, accepting high infantry casualties to achieve breakthrough, generated controversy that continued decades after battle. Critics argued that more innovative tactics, better coordination, or different operational approaches could have achieved victory with fewer casualties. Defenders argued that breakthrough of heavily fortified positions necessarily required high casualties, that Montgomery's systematic approach minimized casualties relative to objectives achieved, and that previous commanders' attempts at low-casualty operations had failed catastrophically. The debate remained unresolved because counterfactuals cannot be proven. What is certain is that Montgomery's methods worked, achieved decisive victory, and established pattern for subsequent operations in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy. Whether different methods might have worked better remains eternally debatable but ultimately irrelevant because Montgomery's methods were applied and succeeded. The 13,500 casualties purchased victory that ended Axis threat to Egypt, secured British position in Middle East, and contributed to broader strategic turning point in November 1942 when Axis expansion ceased and Allied counteroffensive began.